Monday, September 29th, 2020 to order. Good evening, Council, and those who may be watching and or on the Zoom call. And due to the fact that we remain in the COVID-19 pandemic and under a governor's order, and as allowed by the Iowa Code, the special meeting of the Ames City Council is conducted as an electronic meeting. And if you wish to participate, you can go to zoom.us/J/826-593-023, or we do have a toll-free number, 888-475-4499, and you will need to enter the Zoom ID meeting number, which is 826-593-023. You can also view the meeting online on youtube.com/Ames Channel 12, or you can go to our website, cityofames.org/Channel 12, or Mediacom Channel 12 is the other option. So tonight we're going to go ahead and start with the consent agenda. There are two items. Oh, I'll bring to the council's attention too. We are working from an amended agenda. There was a correction on the ordinance number on consent. Instead of 4420, it's actually 4421. So any questions or anything that council wants to pull on the consent agenda? Seeing none, entertain a motion to approve consent as amended.
Move consent as amended.
Second.
Betcher and Junk, thank you. Roll call, please.
Betcher.
Aye.
Garten.
Aye.
Junk.
Aye.
Corrieri.
Aye.
Martin.
Aye.
Beatty Hansen.
Aye.
Thank you. All right, we're going to move on now to the workshop portion. And just by way of a little bit of introduction, the procedure that we're going to follow tonight is as follows. First of all, staff's going to present the report in its entirety. Then after they complete their presentation, council will ask questions or have some limited amount of discussion. Then we will open it up to public comment. And following that public comment, council may have a few concluding comments or questions before we move on to the following of the remaining items on the agenda. I just want to stress again that there will be no decisions made this evening unless or except for if council decides to go ahead and move to place this report and or recommendations on a future agenda. And the public's also invited to continue submitting comments to council via email, as some of you already have, so that those can be taken into consideration as council considers any action on the items at a future meeting time. And also when we get to public comment, we'll talk about some protocols and processes. But at this point in time, I'm going to turn it over to Steve and let him make the presentation. Steve?
Thank you, Mayor and Council. I appreciate you devoting a significant amount of time to go over what I believe is one of the most important topics we have discussed, at least in my 41 years with the City of Ames. And we do intend to go through this document. It's very lengthy, but we took all these suggestions to heart as a staff and thought long and hard about a response to each and every one of these suggestions. So we're going to be going through it in a lot of detail. It's to educate not only the council, but the public on how we're handling some of the issues today and our suggestions for making improvements to how we handle the policing in the City of Ames. So if you bear with us, we'll go through this. I think there's a lot of good information in here. I will warn you, and in fact, I know some will argue that we went too far. Others will argue that we haven't gone far enough. But I can again tell you, we took all these comments very seriously and tried to balance the comments in our recommendations based on the laws that exist today and what we think we can legitimately accomplish in the near future. So this all began, I think, unfortunately, with the death of George Floyd, when the City Council began receiving many emails for input in questioning, I think, the manner in which our law enforcement and criminal justice systems are being operated here in the city of Ames. The input included many questions about our policing philosophy and our operations, as well as offering suggestions, recommendations, and even demands to modify how the Ames Police Department functions in those areas. Now, rather than each one of you respond individually to these suggestions or emails, if you recall, you requested me as city manager to receive all the emails from you all, to compile them, to review them, and perhaps compile them into specific themes, where there was common themes in all the emails, and also offer recommendations how we should react to those suggestions and themes. So that's what I've done for you. After reviewing the emails that you sent to me, and there was a large pile of those emails, I came up with what I believe to be at least 9 themes that came out of the suggestions from the emails. They include organizational structure, police officer recruitment and selection, police officer training and education, police department policies, city ordinances and state laws, transparency, accountability and complaint handling and discipline, communication, and lastly, funding. Now, if you note, you'll note the report is broken down by each theme, and we have 3 breakouts of categories for you under each theme. One will be, I tried to summarize and paraphrase the common theme or question that was asked in this, according to this theme. Number 2, we took a lot of time explaining how we're currently dealing with this issue to give background information. Sometimes people weren't aware of what we're currently doing in this area. And finally, where I thought was appropriate, I tried to give a recommendation because we are committed to moving forward to improving our policing and our relationship with all citizens in the city of Ames. The recommendations you see reflected in this report are influenced by community members themselves, suggestions made to us, input from the police department and the police officers and their suggestions. We try to look at other peer departments and activities and services that we provided throughout the country. And lastly, I think we've linked for you the guidance from the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. Now, many of you ask, how have the police officer reacted to this list of recommendations? Have they given input? So I want Jeff just to cover that just a moment before we move on to the themes.
Thank you. Mayor and Council, I first want to thank you for your time tonight so we can present this report to you. I think we've taken a proactive approach to address the feedback we have all received. Our police officers have embraced this document as it speaks to the hard work we have collectively done over many years. Our staff embrace the concepts of procedural justice and universal fairness. We solicit feedback from our citizens that we serve, and this document has some of that in it. We have no interest in unequal or unfair outcomes and strive for justice. I am confident that our officers are some of the best you will find, and I'm profoundly proud of all of them. I know they believe in continuous improvement. They also know that they are not perfect, but they strive to be, and this is the reason they're supportive of this document. While it documents our past and current efforts, it also shows a path forward to make us a better police department. We strive to serve every single citizen of Ames, and we look forward to the future where we build even stronger relationships with our citizens to make us all safer. I want to thank each member of the department for their hard work, their collaboration, and their role in this document, and their willingness to improve. And I hope that that shows in what you see tonight.
Thanks, Jeff. So let's start out with the first theme called organizational culture. Many individuals who provide input wanted to assure that there is not a culture of racial bias embedded in the Ames Police Department. And I think I'll take the lead on this because, as you know, an organizational culture is defined by the person who leads the organization. I think you also know over the past decades that as city manager, I've tried to create a values-driven culture in all departments in the city of Ames. That initiative, as you know, is known as Excellence Through People. Now, the 2 goals of our organizational initiative are to provide exceptional service at the best price to all of our customers, whether they be visitors, residents, business owners, and 2, to provide an enjoyable and stimulating work environment for all those who work for the city of Ames. Now, in order to accomplish these two goals, every employee is expected to bring each of our 13 values to life each day. And we have those 13 values listed in my report. I won't go over them, but I think you've seen those before. Now, to achieve the overarching goal of ETP is essential to ensure that all the systems in our organizations are in place to reinforce these values. Therefore, the city's initial hiring and selection process, promotional decisions, disciplinary determinations, pay increases for non-union employees are all tied to whether or not employees' behavior reflects these values. Each department head, including the police chief, must make sure that their employees live these 13 values each day. Now, in addition to that, I've tried to establish 2 advisory groups for myself. Maybe you've heard of my community advisory group. It's composed of residents from groups that are traditionally underrepresented in the community. And I've asked them to provide me input regarding how they believe our city organization is doing in delivering services to these group of citizens. And more recently, we've created a diversity and inclusion team made up of city employees in Ames to provide input regarding our internal policies and practices that might negatively impact our workforce. Now, I understand, as Jeff said, that we all are not perfect. And if we do have isolated experiences of inappropriate behavior in the police department, it's never acceptable. But I don't believe it's a result of a culture of bias embedded in the police department. I think our employees and our police department employees are dedicated to our ETP values. Now, while it can be argued that our existing ETP values are geared to promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion, these words are not specifically mentioned in the 13 values you see below. So my first recommendation, and this has to do with the culture not only in the police department, but throughout the city of Ames and all the services we provide. It's my recommendation that the values that drive Excellence Through People initiative will be revised to include new values of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as was the case with all ETP values, the city staff members will be expected to conduct their work in a manner that upholds these values. Support of these values will be used to evaluate candidates as an entry-level and promotional positions with the city, and additional annual performance appraisals will provide an ongoing assessment of how the employees are doing in bringing these values to life in their work every day. My second recommendation that I'll be recommending during the next budget cycle, and that's for fiscal year 2021, which you know you'll be dealing with in February of 21, that we create a new full-time position of diversity, equity, inclusion coordinator be created for the organization, not just for the police department. It's needed throughout our organization. Now, this position will assist with the training of employees on the topics we can talk about that are important, recruitment of employees, how we recruit a diversified workforce. They'll review our personnel policies to help ensure that all departments, not just the police department, within the city of organization, support the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion. In addition, this position can also serve as a staff person for the Ames Human Relations Commission, which is something they've requested in the past, which will allow them to be more proactive with their programming within the community. All right? In terms of the second theme, and that is the police officer recruitment and selection process. And I believe I'm adequately paraphrasing what I heard in all those emails that I read regarding this topic. The major emphasis expressed under this theme is the need to have a process in place so that applicants for the Ames Police Department position are thoroughly vetted to ensure that they do not have a history of abuse, racism, xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia, or discrimination. Some have suggested that a periodic follow-up throughout the career of an officer to ensure that no discriminatory attitudes have developed. Now, in this particular case, I want to turn over to Jeff because I want to go over it. I know this recruitment and selection process is quite complex because it involves a number of laws outside of our own policies. So I want Jeff to go over this particular topic. What are we doing? How are we handling police officer recruitment and selection.
Well, I can tell you the timing couldn't be better because we're out to recruit right now. And so we'll be looking for police officer candidates coming up in the near future. And so you can all out there help us by looking for good candidates for Ames police officers and send them our way. So perfect timing. So as you know, there's some state requirements that anyone needs to meet set by the Iowa Law Enforcement Academy to be certified as a peace officer in the state of Iowa. And there's a long list of things. And I won't go through them all, but you have to be 18 years of age, hold a valid driver's license, all those kind of things. And then we really got into our recruiting process, which is based upon Iowa Chapter 400, which is civil service. So we have to follow civil service rules, and those rules and laws are meant to make sure that we're filling city job openings based on merit and nothing else. And for the civil service part of the process, applicants that meet the minimum requirements and receive a 70 or higher on the civil service testing are put on a list of candidates that are eligible to be hired by the police department. And we can hire anybody off of that certified list. And that list can be up to 40 people, but usually it's not that many, and it hasn't been for quite some time. Our last list was actually 8 people, and we have expired that list. So as you know, because I think you've heard us say before, there's a physical exam. So there's the PT test where you have to run and do sit-ups and push-ups. There's the post test, which is the police officer selection test that all applicants must take to be eligible to be considered, and you have to pass that test. So our candidates go through all those things. We also get some help in recruiting, and we send out information to quite a few different areas to solicit for good candidates. Some of those are universities such as Iowa State, Simpson College, University of Northern Iowa, Des Moines Area Community College, Kirkwood, the list goes on. So we send that information out to try and help us recruit and get good candidates. The other step that we take, and we've done for quite some time, is we offer usually a test preparation assistance. And so what we do is we invite people that sign up to be candidates to come in, and we go through the process with them before we start so that they have a good idea of what to expect moving through this process. And one of those things is to explain to them how the physical testing will be conducted and what to expect on the post test. And I'll tell you that the post test is kind of like a basic skills test, but if you haven't done some of those things for a while, you might have trouble passing them. And we've had people that especially have trouble with math. If you haven't done math for a while, come to our prep class and we'll remind you how to do all those things. So once we have all of those things done, we have the minimum requirements. You pass through the first pieces of that testing process. Then we move on to bringing our finalists in to have an interview with our command staff. And generally that's the commanders and the chief and sometimes some of our lieutenants. And we have a conversation with these candidates. And we're talking about our ETP values. We're seeing how people align with the values of the city and whether they're a good fit for us. And then if we like you after that part of the process, then we go to a conditional offer of employment. And as a lot of people know, that's really when this whole thing starts. And we have to do then a background interview. And it's not unusual for a background investigation by one of our investigators to take 4 to 6 weeks to complete, because we will interview everyone that you list as potential, lost my word there. Anybody that you list that you know, could be roommates, friends, people that are important in your life, and then we go through and we find all the people that you didn't put on the form and we go talk to them as well. We've sent investigators out of state in some cases to do background checks. Investigators also look for bias, they look for extremism and other attitudes or a history that conflicts with the values of the city. So that's a part of this process in the early stages. Then if candidates pass through the backgrounding process, then the next piece of this is a polygraph examination. And the polygraph looks for honesty and integrity. It also looks for if you're concealing any misconduct or disqualifying behaviors. So that's part of what that is. If you pass that, then the next stage is the psychological test. We use the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, and all candidates have to take that. We also go through an extra step of a clinical interview with our psychologist who evaluates the candidates for evidence of bias, immaturity, emotional instability, propensity to violence, and anything else that would exclude them from a good career in law enforcement. We take those very seriously. If that goes well, then the next step is the medical exam. So everybody needs to be checked out, make sure that their vision is correct and all that. And so that's the steps that we go through. So from start to finish, when you may apply to be a police officer until we get to the final stage of actually hiring you, can be up to 4 to 6 months.
My recommendation 3 under this particular category of theme is that realizing that all individuals has some form of implicit bias. I'm going to ask the Human Relations Department staff to explore additional validated evaluation tools that perhaps we can use in the police officer selection process to help us better predict whether candidates have a propensity to inappropriately act upon any bias they may have. Theme number 3 is once we've hired someone, there's a question about officer training and education. So it's important to note that many people provided input that police officers who are hired receive training in the following topics: de-escalation of altercations, medical assistance, symptomatic racism, the historic role of police in maintaining oppressive social structures, implicit bias, and cultural competency. So again, I'll call on Jeff to explain the kind of training we've been offering our officers over time.
So in addition to the ETP values of the city and the new employee orientation and all those, specific to the police department, we have some training we do. And that starts in the Iowa Law Enforcement Academy. So every police officer needs to be certified by the state as a peace officer. And while they're at the Iowa Law Enforcement Academy, in their basic training, they receive 10 hours of bias diversity training and 8 hours of de-escalation training. So they get that right from the start of the academy. And in addition, those topics are woven into all of the other training components that they use, including the firearms program, defensive tactics, criminal law, and investigation of criminal activity. So those are all worked into all of those other sections that they have to learn as well. In addition, we've done a lot of department-wide training over the years. And you can see some of those topics in the report, but cultural diversity and some subtopics of cultural competency, cultural of new immigrants, special population. We've done fair and impartial policing, obviously communications, de-escalation. There's a term verbal judo that you might hear, which is very similar to de-escalation training. Procedural justice, implicit bias, understanding class in law enforcement, and mental health first aid. And additionally, we've taken some of our folks and we have sent them off to training to be certified trainers in some of these topics. And that will help us going forward to develop a better training system for our officers. So we already have certified trainers in fair and impartial policing, procedural justice, implicit bias, and mental health first aid. And very soon, we're sending a couple of our officers to de-escalation train the trainer training. So they will then be trainers in de-escalation. We've also worked with our dispatchers over the years on something we call bias by proxy. And what I mean by that is we sometimes have people that will call in suspicious activity that we have a hard time really understanding what is suspicious about that activity. And so we are training our dispatch staff to ask some clarifying questions to make sure that we're responding to reported unlawful activity and not something that's just has a racial undertone to it. And so we've been working with them for a while to do a better job of screening those types of calls.
Okay, recommendation number 4 is work with the Human Resources Department to develop a more formalized curriculum for each and every officer, whether they're new coming onto the city or they've been here for a number of years regarding diversity and bias topics. We certainly have a lot of coursework out there, as you've seen, but I don't think we've formalized the curriculum. So I want to formalize that, make sure it happens more frequently, and there's some strategy behind this education philosophy. Recommendation number 5, that I'll be recommending in the next budget cycle, converting a vacant authorized police officer position from a police officer position to administrative sergeant position. This new position will manage the department training needs. Follow it along, make sure each one of these employees receive the training we've talked about according to the more formalized curriculum. Also will help in our transparency issue you'll see later on when we have to report more statistical reporting on our websites and to the public. And will help supervise these new employees during their onboarding when they first come on, their orientation, if you will, and their experience in the academy process. And there'll be some other duties they'll also be assigned. Okay, one of the areas you see on a lot of our letters, I saw in a lot of our letters, had to do with an area called 8 Can't Wait campaign. I don't know if you've seen that throughout the country. I've tried to lay out, actually there are 10 requests that that input was received on for influencing our personnel policies, such as one, they wanted us to ban chokeholds, strangleholds, hog tying methods, wanted to require officers to de-escalate situations when possible. They wanted to require officers to give verbal warnings before shooting. They wanted to ban shooting and moving vehicles. They wanted to require officers to report each time they use force or threaten the use of force. They wanted to ban civilians being transported in uncomfortable positions, such as face down in a vehicle. They wanted to ban the use of tear gas. They wanted to require officers to use and wear body cameras and have them on. Require officers to properly subdue a person that has already been handcuffed. And finally, require officers, after using force, to perform the necessary medical care and call for paramedics for support. So I want Jeff to go over this is taking a while, I want to go over the policies that are currently in place and how do they relate to the request that you saw in the emails.
I'm happy to say that many of our policies were already in compliance with some of this to begin with. We didn't have to change our policies much, but I will highlight a couple of changes as we go through. So first of all, it's important to note that the police department contracts with Lexipol, and it's a nationally recognized policy advisory firm. And they monitor best practices, changing legislation and case law, and they help us update our policies so that they're always up to date with any changes in the law or when best practices might change. In addition to receiving advice, obviously, from Lexipol, we also have staff attorneys, the city attorney. We have the county attorney who will give us advice on our policies, the Iowa Attorney General, the attorneys and staff associated with the Iowa Community Assurance School, that's our insurer for the city ICAP, and they actually give us a grant to use Lexipol. So they give us money back when we use Lexipol to help pay for that product because it's not free. And I'd like to also start by saying the use of force is rare in the city of Ames by our police officers. In 2019, we had 31,629 calls for service. That's quite a bit. And we used force in 117 incidents. So 117 incidents out of 31,629. So that's 0.37% of all calls for service. And as you can see in the report, we made 1,872 arrests in that same year. And we had to use force in just 70 of those incidents, or 3.7%. So you can say in 96% of all arrests, we have people that are perfectly compliant and no force is necessary by the officers. And that's how we want them all to turn out. But I just wanted to point out how rare force really is being used in the city of Ames.
Excuse me, Jeff, can you define force too, use of force?
Yeah, so force can be anything from an officer grabbing someone and directing them, all the way up to obviously the use of deadly force or a firearm. So most of our force incidents are that first kind, grabbing someone to put them into custody or directing them. We rarely use any striking instruments. It's actually very uncommon anymore to use a baton. Taser display is a use of force, and obviously deploying the taser is a use of force. So all of those things are categorized. So anytime an officer uses force, they put that in their report. In fact, there's a checkbox in our report for use of force, and then we review all those incidents. So the first one in this group was the ban chokehold. So this is one area we did change our policy slightly to make sure we were in compliance. Many of you may know that the state of Iowa recently changed the deadly force section in 804.8 of the Iowa Code. And what they did is they added chokeholds into the deadly force. So now it says deadly force, including chokeholds. And so our policy would only allow a chokehold to be used in a deadly force situation and no other. So while we do prohibit chokeholds, just not in a deadly force situation. So hopefully that's clear in our policy that that's the only time a chokehold could be used. In the second section, officers required to de-escalate situations when possible, and we do that. There are several policies that address de-escalation, but I want to make it clear that we do not use a force continuum. We use force options, and the reason we don't use a continuum is because a continuum would lead most people to believe you have to start at level 1, and then if that doesn't work, you move to level 2, then level 3, and that's really not how it works. Force options means that the officer will address any resistance and use the lowest level of force that they can to get compliance. And that may be no force at all in some cases. So that's why we call it force options versus force continuum. And I think you'll find in most contemporary policing, most places have gone to that, including Lexipol. So in our policies are all numbered. So in 300.3.5, we talk about de-escalation, and when circumstances permit, we want officers to use nonviolent strategies and techniques to decrease the intensity of the situation, improve decision-making, improve communications, reduce the need for force, and increase voluntary compliance. So we already tell our officers that's what we want, is to very rarely use force and only use it when it's perfectly necessary. The other thing about our policy is all uses of force have to be reasonable. And we lay out in 300.3.2 the factors used to determine the reasonableness of force. So I'll just go through a couple because it's a very long list that officers will go through, but one of those is the immediacy and severity of the threat to the officer or others. So that's obviously going to help the officer decide what level of force is necessary to get compliance, and always at the lowest level. The effects of suspected drug or alcohol use. It's another thing that we'll evaluate. The mental state or capacity of the person that we're dealing with is something that we will look at. The seriousness of the offense and the reason for contact with the individual. So there's a lot of things that our officers will look at when they're trying to decide whether or not to use force at all and what level of force they might use. The next section was require officers to give verbal warnings before shooting. And our policy already addressed that in 306.7.3 to talk about warning and other shots. Now, warning shots are prohibited by the state of Iowa, but verbal warnings should be utilized whenever possible, unless the utterance would compromise the safety of the officers or others. So in most cases, that's going to mean that an officer will give a warning when they can before deadly force is used, especially firing a firearm. The next section was ban shooting at moving vehicles. Again, this policy had been in place for quite some time before any of the report came up. And we do not have an outright ban on shooting at moving vehicles, but we also recognize that it may not be the best way to handle it. So an officer should only discharge a firearm at a moving vehicle or its occupants when the officer reasonably believes there are no other reasonable means available to avert the imminent threat of the vehicle, or if deadly force other than the vehicle is directed at the officer or others. So again, they're only going to shoot at a moving vehicle if that's the only option they have left and they have no way to retreat out of the way. And we also have a ban on shooting at any part of the vehicle to disable it. So we don't, and like in the movies, we don't do that, try and shoot a tire out. That just doesn't work. So we do not do that as well. Another part of this was require officers to intervene and stop the use of excessive force by other officers. So again, this was already in our policy in 300.2.1, which is the duty to intercede and report. So any officer present and observing another law enforcement officer, a member using force, is clearly beyond that which is objectively reasonable under the circumstances, shall, when in a position to do so, intercede to prevent the use of unreasonable force. So we already required our officers, if they saw another officer using more force than necessary, to step in and stop that. One of the things that we've talked with our officers about is they need to be cognizant when they're getting upset and not being afraid to ask other officers to step in and give them a hand and kind of tap out and let somebody else handle it if they're getting upset. The next one was require officers to report each time they use force or threaten to use force against civilians. And I'll say we actually go further than this in our policy, which was already in place. So we mandate that our officers document every use of force. So that's where that 117 number came from, is those documented use of force incidents. Beyond just documenting that we use force, which is everything from grabbing onto somebody on up, we also require notification to supervisors as soon as practical. So again, we go beyond just reporting the use of force to making sure a supervisor is aware that force has been used. And our supervisors review each use of force report that comes in to look for the reasonableness of that force based on that long list of criteria a little bit earlier on. Ban transporting civilians in an uncomfortable position, such as face down in a vehicle. We had a lot of discussions about this a long time ago when we started to learn about something called positional asphyxiation. And that is when you have arrested someone, and usually when they're non-compliant and they're put in a vehicle face down. And there were many cases across the United States where people were very susceptible to that positional asphyxiation and they died. And so we've been doing this for quite some time, telling people you never transport a prisoner face down. So if we have someone that's behaving in a manner so violent and uncooperative that we can't sit them upright, then we're going to review medical condition by an emergency medical services provider. So we'll have somebody step in and evaluate that person to see if a medical condition exists. So we don't hog tie and we don't transport face down, and that's in 904.4 of our procedures. Page down here to ban the use of tear gas. So the use of chemical munitions by the police department is limited to riot situations where life and or property is in danger. And this would not include peaceful protests. So I want to make that very clear. We would not use chemical munitions on any kind of peaceful protest. Tear gas, although deployed extremely infrequently, can be an effective dispersal tool when circumstances warrant. And without this option, officers with the need to disperse a violent crowd would need to resort to alternative force techniques, such as batons or hand-on techniques. These alternatives can present a greater risk of injury or death to both the individuals and to the officers involved. And so that's why we do not believe an outright ban on chemical munitions is a good idea. But obviously, we have to justify any use of force, and the use of tear gas is a use of force. We do have a policy that presents some guidelines for our staff in 303.6, and it basically goes through what I just went through. Tear gas can be used for crowd control, crowd dispersal, or against barricaded suspects based on circumstances. And so we lay that out. So I want it to be clear, we're not going to be using chemical munitions on peaceful protesters, only on violent riots. Also, we have a policy, policy 430, discusses First Amendment assemblies and distinguishes that between lawful peaceful assemblies and assemblies that meet criteria to be unlawful due to the destruction of property or harm to others. We also spell that out. Require officers to have their body cameras on. So if you didn't know, we've had body cameras for 2 years in October. So just a few days and we'll hit our 2-year mark on our our body worn cameras. Prior to that, we had cameras in all of our police cars. And so it's important to know we've been using cameras for a long time, body worn cameras, relatively new at 2 years. Policy 424.5 addresses the circumstances that require activation of those cameras, both body worn and in-car cameras. And generally, officers are expected to activate those cameras during law enforcement interactions. So we've had these for 2 years. We have recorded 41,919 clips of video, and that is 22 terabytes of data on a big drive down in the basement. And in addition to that, before we had our current WatchGuard system, we had a system called L3, and we're still maintaining 11 terabytes of that data. So there's a lot of data that's been recorded over those 2 years and longer when it comes to the in-car cameras. So the recorders should be activated in any of the following situations for our law enforcement officers. So in investigative contacts, including stops and field interview situations, they'll turn the camera on. Traffic stops, including but not limited to traffic violations, stranded motorist assistance, and all crime interdiction stops. Self-initiated activity in which an officer would normally notify the communication center, and any other contact that becomes adversarial after the initial contact in a situation that would not otherwise require recording. So if you had an interaction with someone, it starts to get adversarial, we want the officers to turn those cameras on at that point. Require officers to properly subdue a person that is already handcuffed. We have quite a few policies that address handcuffing and restraints, including the proper application of handcuffs and other restraints. 302.4 is the application of handcuffs or plastic cuffs. And handcuffs, including temporary nylon or plastic cuffs, may be used only to restrain a person's hands to ensure officer safety. Now, our policy also does give the officer some discretion not to handcuff somebody. So there are very limited circumstances where we actually think it might be safer not to handcuff somebody. And some of those might be in medical situations. But I will say, as a general rule, we do handcuff people that have been arrested or have been violent and we're trying to restrain so that they don't hurt themselves and they don't hurt the officers. Require officers after using force to perform the necessary medical care and call the paramedics for support. So we have a policy on that as well. 300.6 is medical considerations. Any individual exhibiting signs of physical distress after an encounter should be continuously monitored until they can be medically assessed. Individuals should not be placed on their stomachs for an extended period, as this could impair their ability to breathe, or what I talked about earlier called positional asphyxiation, which is really hard for me to say. Also, individuals who exhibit extreme agitation, violent, irrational behavior accompanied by profuse sweating, extraordinary strength beyond their physical characteristics, and impervious to pain, sometimes called drug-induced delirium or excited delirium. I'm sure you've heard about that in the news. Those people require immediate medical attention. That is a medical emergency. And we have trained our officers to recognize the signs and symptoms of either drug-induced delirium or excited delirium. So we immediately get medical rolling so that they can assess that person.
Okay, under this particular theme, I have 3 recommendations. Recommendation number 6 is, first of all, you should know that in the spirit of transparency, we've placed all these police department rules and regulations and policies on the website, the police department's website. So I'll continue to commit that as revisions are made to the police department policy, these revisions will be updated on the website. It's very important that the public sees these, because if there's a problem, if they believe or there's inappropriate policies, having that in the light of day will allow them to come before the city council or the police chief or city manager to ask that they be changed or revised. Recommendation number 7 is, it's my intention, as you'll see later on in recommendation number 16, to create a new Citizen Police Advisory Committee. And one of the primary responsibilities will be to continually review our policies and practices of the Ames Police Department and make recommendations to the chief and the city manager for changes where they believe it's needed. And finally, we'll continue to use Lexipol, which helps us make sure that our policies are in compliance with federal state laws and also under any court cases that may have clarified these particular areas. I want to mention about Lexipol. Lexipol, if you check what they're recommending for us in our state of Iowa, you might see another city in a different state have a different recommendation, a different policy, because state laws are different. And ultimately, they just make recommendations. It's up to, through our attorneys or even the city council or ourselves, to establish a policy we want and practice. So they don't dictate it, they make recommendations to us. So if there's any problems people see with our policies, we have the ability to change it. We're not bound by this relationship to adopt verbatim policies they're suggesting. Those are the three recommendations I have under this particular category. Now, let's move into theme 5. This is very important to people. Some people who are aware of the police department policies are concerned that they can be altered by the city administration. In other words, by the chief of police or the city manager. Therefore, they would prefer that certain prohibitions be placed into ordinances where the city council has control over what actions are illegal and must be publicly voted on to eliminate or modify. Now, some of the suggestions I saw in the emails for new local ordinances include ban racial profiling, prohibit racial bias in policing, prohibit an unjust accusation from one person against another to the police department because of that person's race, decriminalize the use and possession of marijuana for less than 40 grams. Jeff, why don't you cover this area for us? What are we currently doing in this area in terms of the policies?
So as you said, people are asking for an ordinance, but we thought it was important to point out first that we do have policies prohibiting all of these, or the first three of those things. So racial profiling, racial bias in policing are prohibited in the police department's bias-based policing policy. And this policy is 401 in the manual. So right at the beginning of that, this policy provides guidance to department members that affirms that the Ames Police Department's commitment to policing that is fair and objective. And we actually have a number of policies that speak to this, but 401.3 is bias-based policing prohibited. So bias-based policing is strictly prohibited, pretty clear. And then we've got it's a long one, 401.4.1, reason for contact. Officers contacting a person shall be prepared to articulate sufficient reason for the contact independent of the protected characteristic of the individual. So we have to have a reason if we're going to stop and hold you. Now that doesn't mean that we can't stop out and have a conversation with anyone, because we do that frequently. But to stop you and restrict your movement, we better be able to articulate the reason for that. In 401.5, we get our supervisors involved. So supervisors should monitor those individuals under their command for compliance with this policy and shall handle any alleged or observed violations in accordance with the personnel complaints policy. So we want to make sure that not only are our officers trained to not use bias-based policing or racial profiling, we also want to make sure that our supervisors are watching for it. Accusations of racial discrimination in policing can be investigated by the Iowa Civil Rights Commission as well. And Iowa Code Chapter 718.6.1 prohibits knowingly reporting false information to law enforcement agencies. So we wanted to point out that there is an Iowa code now that speaks to false reporting. Now that's not based on race, that's just based on any kind of false report. And that can be except when falsely alleged criminal act is a serious or aggravated misdemeanor or felony, in which case the false report is punishable as a serious misdemeanor. So there's different levels of false reporting under state code. And then under state law, the possession of 40 grams of marijuana is a serious misdemeanor, and that's set by the state and obviously not by the city of Ames.
All right. Under this particular theme, I'm giving you recommendation 9 and 10. I'm giving you examples of some ordinances you could pass. This would be above and beyond any departmental policies. For example, you could adopt an ordinance prohibiting any member of the city organization, that'd be from the city council on down, from racially profiling or taking actions that are indicative of bias in the delivery of city services. So if we believe in this, this is not just for the police department. It's for all the services we provide to our citizens to commit to the delivery of service free of bias. That could be one local ordinance. Secondly, under 10, you could adopt a local ordinance that prohibits the filing of false reports or providing false information to the police against an individual because of a race or an other protected characteristic. Now, Mark might want to help you on page 27. I have at the bottom some caveats that I think the city attorney might want to go over on these ordinances, especially relates to, I think, number 10.
Right. Thanks, Steve. Regarding the a local ordinance that would prohibit filing false reports on the basis of someone's race or other protected characteristic, we are allowed to do that under state law. There, as Jeff noted, there is a state law that says that filing a false report for any reason is either a simple misdemeanor or a serious misdemeanor, depending on what the underlying crime is that the false report is alleging. But we could pass an ordinance that's specific, but the most penalty we could give to that didn't come out very well. The highest penalty we could give for that would be a simple misdemeanor, because state law limits cities to establishing simple misdemeanors as a maximum. So we could do a municipal infraction or a simple misdemeanor, but we can't do anything beyond that.
Okay. Transparency is a theme that I heard. Very important, transparency. If we're going to accomplish what we want from our police department, we have to share information with our citizens. So we can say we're doing a great job, but does the data prove that we are? So in order for citizens to better gauge how successful our police officers are doing in providing unbiased policing, it is important that data be furnished to the public. It has been suggested that data should be periodically released, such as for arrest records, stop records, the number of civilian deaths that occur while in police custody, and the number of civilian deaths that occur as a result of force. It has been further suggested to break these reports down according to various demographics. So, Jeff, what are we doing in this regard today?
So I think the first thing, it's important to note that our records management system is designed to take information from the field and get it to the court system. So in many cases, it was not designed to pull some of the information that some people desire. And that is a limitation of the software. But we do try to get information out, and there are some standardized reports. So right now, if you go to the police department's website, we do publish online a press log and an arrest report. And those are both 4 days worth of data. So it's a rolling 4 days. So I think every day at like 4 a.m., they'll run that press log and the arrest log, which has some information that you might look for. We also obviously provide annual reports when it comes to budget time about the city budget and those statistical and financial summaries. Another thing that we did voluntarily engage in 2019, the Ames Police Department, along with Iowa State University, initiated a traffic stop study to evaluate whether racial disparity exists in traffic stops conducted by both departments. And we're hoping that the results of the study will be available in the fall of 2020. We initially took and sent our 2018 data in to be analyzed. We're now in the process of moving into our 2019 data to be analyzed. And we're hoping that that will be done relatively soon, again, hopefully fall, early winter of this year.
Okay, in terms of the theme transparency, I'm going to recommend that we publish quarterly summaries on the police department's website regarding citations. So those are citations involve traffic tickets, municipal infractions, simple misdemeanors, and arrests with a breakdown by race or other demographics where known. Recommendation number 12, we'll publish quarterly reports on the police department website with the use of force statistics with a breakdown of race and other demographics where known. Now, I want to highlight that it should be understood that demographic information is not collected in every police interaction. Some state reports required collecting demographic information and some do not. If demographics are not provided on an individual's documentation, such as an ID card, police officers will not ask or make assumptions to obtain this information. Under recommendation number 13, we hope to create, and I'll recommend we create a new system for citizens to report bias incidents. Publish this data on the police department website and share these reports with the Human Relations Commission for their follow-up. Now, you need to understand that bias incidents are events where there's a connection to racial bias, but they do not meet the requirements for a hate crime. The crime has not been committed. But it will allow us to have the Human Relations Commission intervene and follow up where we see some of this unacceptable behavior occurring. And number 4, we have on our own with the Iowa State University initiated this STOP study. The first, I think we're only one of the few cities in the state of Iowa who've done this, so we can learn and improve in this particular area. But my recommendation will be that we will continue to conduct periodic studies on STOP statistics to identify whether racial disparity exists in traffic stops conducted by the police department. So my point is, we're not one and done here. We're going to look at the information. We're going to be able to discuss it with our police officers, and we want to have periodic updates. Probably won't be doing every year, but periodically, maybe every 2 or 3 years, we'll perform this STOP study. Accountability, complaint handling, and discipline. In the emails, it has been suggested that complaints regarding inappropriate action by police officers cannot be fairly addressed when the discipline process is contained within the department. Therefore, it has been suggested that an independent body be created to investigate and determine discipline for officers accused of such action. Now, this is a complex subject also, where we have a number of laws Jeff will go over that that we are required to follow. So I want you to understand how the process works. So Jeff, why don't you talk about this area for me?
So complaints about officer conduct can be handled through a number of different processes. We obviously have an internal complaint process where you can bring a complaint to any member of the Ames Police Department. They'll get it to a supervisor. Then externally, an individual can file an Iowa Civil Rights Commission complaint. And if a person believes that they were treated unfairly on the basis of race, gender, age, or another characteristic protected by the Iowa Civil Rights Act, they can file a report with them. And when those happen, we are required to turn over information to the Iowa Civil Rights Commission for review. There's also the Iowa Ombudsman's Office. So a person can make a complaint with them, and it's a similar procedure for the police department. If we get a complaint through their office, then again, we'll supply information and they'll do their own kind of review and investigation. But to talk about our process internally, our complaints can be filed in writing, or you can give them orally. We will have people that will call in on the phone, and sometimes we get emails. So they can come in a lot of different ways. But however those come in, we try and investigate them as much as we can. So sometimes we have what are called personnel complaints, and those are where an allegation of misconduct or improper job performance has been made. If true, it would be a violation of established policy or law. So one of those 550 pages of policy that's on our website. The other type we would call inquiries, which are more if it was true, it would not be a violation of law or a policy and not considered a personnel complaint. And these are usually handled more informally by a supervisor. And honestly, these are more procedural questions more than anything. Someone may be stopped in a traffic stop and they have questions about the procedure of how that worked out. And a lot of times the supervisor can just explain, this is how we do this and this is how we do this. And most of the time people understand that, oh, that's the procedure you follow, that's okay. Investigating allegations of misconduct. So an investigation will be usually by an immediate supervisor to start, but depending on the seriousness of the investigation, it may be turned over to the department's internal affairs coordinator. And right now our internal affairs coordinator is also our criminal investigations division commander. So right now you may know Commander Jason Tuttle. He would be our internal affairs coordinator right now. And they would conduct an investigation a lot like we do all of our other investigations that we do every day. So evidence is collected, statements are taken, photographs of any injury. We get all those. Body cameras. Our body worn cameras have been very useful in investigating complaints because we do record most of those public interactions. And then these recordings are reviewed, and when they're complaints, we can use those also to develop performance appraisal information. But when circumstances warrant, the accused employee may be placed on paid administrative leave or temporarily reassigned. I cannot put an officer on unpaid leave without due cause. So that's just part of it. You may have heard of the Peace Officer Bill of Rights, which is Iowa Code Chapter 80F. And they also have some steps that must be taken when dealing with officer complaints and the interview process. So a few of these are the officer must receive a written summary of the complaint prior to being interviewed. So the officer has to know the reason that they're being interviewed. The interview must be recorded, which we do. The interview must take place at a facility of the investigating agency. And the officer has the right to have legal counsel or a union representative. Another thing that comes into play with all of our investigation is something called the Garrity advisement. And what that means is we can require an officer to answer questions if it's for the subject of discipline. So we can basically order an officer to answer any of the questions that we have regarding a complaint or an incident. The statements gathered from the testimony may not be used in any subsequent criminal investigation. That would be separate from this. And the chief of police may request a criminal investigation by an outside law enforcement agency. And so if we believe that one of our officers was engaged in an actual criminal activity, we would most likely call in an outside law enforcement agency, the DCI, or someone else to investigate that because of conflict of interest. So some of the report outcomes that we have when we investigate our complaints. So the first one is unfounded. And that simply means the alleged facts did not occur or did not involve department members. Exonerated, the alleged act occurred, but the act was justified, lawful, and or proper. Not sustained, there is insufficient evidence to sustain the complaint or fully exonerate the employee. Sustained, the act occurred and there was misconduct. Policy failure, this happens from time to time. The allegation is true and the action was not inconsistent with policy. So sometimes we have a policy that's not clear enough and sometimes a complaint can help us clean those up. And then not involved is the last one. The individual subject of the complaint was not involved in the incident at all. And we get that from time to time too. We have 4 or 5 different law enforcement agencies that have jurisdiction within the city of Ames. And sometimes we get confused for other agencies. So sometimes we'll start a complaint, find out it wasn't even us. So in the process, we also have something called a pre-disciplinary hearing. So the officer who is the subject of a complaint is notified of the outcome and conclusion of any investigation. And we work in collaboration with not only the chief of police, but human resources and the city manager's office. So we have to have this pre-disciplinary hearing with the accused officer. And if disciplinary action against an officer is warranted, the chief determines the proposed level of discipline in consultation with the city manager and human resources. And as with other city employees, discipline can take various forms depending on the circumstances. So it can be as low as an oral reprimand, a written reprimand, a suspension, demotion, or possibly up to termination of the employee. The chief of police will provide the employee with a written notice that discipline is being considered, along with access to the materials considered by the chief in reaching that decision. And the employee then has 5 days to respond orally, recorded, or in writing to that. And they would give their reasons why their proposed discipline should not occur. After that, we get to the imposing of the discipline. So following the employee response, the chief may impose the discipline. If the employee, this is important, if the employee resigns or retires while under investigation prior to the conclusion of any kind of disciplinary process, the fact that the investigation discipline was pending is noted in the employee's personnel file. So additionally, resigning while under investigation may prevent the officer from obtaining full retirement benefits from the municipal fire and police retirement system. And an investigation may still continue even if the employee does resign. We obviously can't stop someone from resigning from service. We can't make them stay, but that doesn't mean we have to conclude an investigation either. And there are also appeal rights within the process. So if the investigation results in an officer being disciplined, including the officer could be terminated from employment, state law provides that that disciplinary action must be delayed by 10 days if the accused officer alleges a violation of the procedures followed and outlines, as outlined in the Peace Officer Bill of Rights. Therefore, a disciplinary process disputed by the employee is not likely to be resolved in a matter of days. It's over the course of many days. And there's a lot of time frames within this process. So I'll outline just a few quickly. In step one, within 5 days of the action, the immediate supervisor response must be delivered within 5 working days. And then within, this is the grievance process. So within 5 days of step one, the chief of police must respond within 5 working days. So there's all these time frames built in, which can lead to the process lasting longer. And that's why things are not very quick, but hopefully they do get taken care of properly. In cases of suspension, demotion, or discharge, any non-probationary police officer, regardless of rank, may appeal to the Civil Service Commission for a hearing within 14 calendar days of the decision to impose such action. So again, another amount of time that can take place before the discipline process is finished.
All right. Under this particular theme, you look on page 35, recommendation number 15. What I've learned through my discussions with a number of people in the community, it appears that some people, at least, are intimidated and feel uncomfortable filing complaints against the police department in person, either through the police department themselves, to the police officers or the command staff, or the city manager's office. Therefore, my recommendation on number 15 is we have to change our process to make forms that document complaints readily available on the police department website. Make it simple. They don't have to interact with anybody if they feel intimidated by it, in order for the public to register their concerns about incidents. But perhaps the most meaningful recommendation I have in trying to take a step forward is recommendation number 16. And I'm going to be recommending, and will recommend to the City Council, we create a new Citizen Police Advisory Committee. Now, Ryan, who will go over this with you, has examined a number of different variations to the organization, this type of organization throughout the country. They vary. And they're also, most of them are actually created in accordance with the various state laws that are in place. So our recommendation, after looking at all the different variations, is very specific that we're going to give you today. We believe this model conforms to the state law regarding civil service, our collective bargaining law, the Peace Officers Bill of Rights, and therefore in a position to recommend this particular model to you. I'll let Brian go over the specifics of it. This is not an ordinance form yet, you understand. This is trying to cover at a 20,000-foot level what the committee will do. Brian, you want to go over?
Sure. So as Steve mentioned, this is not an ordinance form. If the council wished to pursue this, we would have to add quite a bit more detail about how to operationalize the components of this proposal. But I'll go over the overview of what we've arrived at after doing research into other models and how the applicable laws and policies work in Ames. And so with the proposed Ames Citizen Police Advisory Committee, there would be 4 primary goals. One would be to incorporate a citizen perspective into a review of these citizen complaints against officers in the police department, provide some perspective outside of law enforcement to help understand a situation. Another would be to provide recommendations regarding the policies and procedures and practices of the police department. The third would be to report concerns regarding the outcome of complaint investigations to the city manager. And then the fourth would be, in general, to just increase the public confidence in the professionalism and accountability of the police department. And so how would those things be accomplished? This is proposed to be a 7-member committee. That seems to be a reasonable number given some of the examples we've seen from around the country, and we think would be manageable with the logistics and what we would be specifically asking them to do. We would want to ensure that the membership of this committee is representative of the diversity of the community in all of its forms. Boards and commissions would be a membership that's nominated by the mayor and confirmed by the city council. And a significant part of their work would involve training. There is a national organization called the National Association of Civilian Oversight of a variety of board committees, such as this one that's proposed, to ensure that they have an appropriate understanding of their responsibilities. We think training would be a significant part of what they would be required to participate in. The membership would have to be committed to impartiality and to review these complaints based only upon the facts and the evidence, and be prejudiced neither in favor of complainants or of police officers. They would have to review these complaints impartially. And they would also be subject to confidentiality requirements. Some of the information that they would be asked to review would need to be reviewed in closed session because it's examining a confidential record. And so they would need to ensure that they follow the requirements under state law to keep those things confidential. So the way this would work is this group would be an additional avenue that somebody could file a complaint with. So in addition to filing a complaint directly with the police department or with the city manager's office or with human resources or any of the other methods that have been described in this report, somebody could file a complaint with a member of this committee who would then turn that complaint over for an internal investigation by the police department in accordance with its procedures and policies and the requirements of state law that Jeff outlined. Once those complaints are obtained and investigated, the chief of police would consult with this group about these complaints to provide that citizen perspective into the alleged incident. So it's important to understand there would be an investigation process that aligns with our existing policies and procedures. There'd be a discipline process that takes place if discipline is warranted at the conclusion of that process. And in the middle, between those two separate processes, would be where this committee would come in. So as the chief of police would receive the evidence and the information from conclusion, the ACPAC, the Citizen Police Advisory Committee, would be consulted with to provide their perspective on the incident, review video footage, review the policies, the standards of evidence that apply in that instance, the statement of the complainant, and provide their perspective on the incident. And then chief of police would take that into consideration when deciding whether to impose discipline, and if so, what level of discipline should be imposed. This group could also be called upon to review departmental policies from time to time, whether it's a policy that they themselves bring up and have a concern about, or if there are policies that the police department wishes to get their feedback on. to make improvements. We would ask them to conduct outreach into the community and help community members understand their police procedures, address concerns related to public safety, help people understand their rights and responsibilities in law enforcement interactions, and then the processes and the resources for filing complaints if they wish to do so. One component of responsibilities for this committee that I noted in a couple examples around the country that I thought was unique is the notion that this committee could also review commendations and accolades if they occur and determine whether an officer's conduct might merit an award. We have processes for that now. We have some awards for certain actions that officers might make, and it would be helpful to provide or to receive the perspective of this group in determining whether such an award is merited. And then an annual report would be issued to the mayor and council, and that report would outline the number of complaints reviewed and the nature of them, demographic information of the complainants if that is disclosed, a summary of the policies that are reviewed and any changes recommended, a summary of the training that was received by the committee members, a summary of the outreach activities that they conducted, and any concerns that they might have about the complaint investigation outcomes if they have any concerns. So because this would be advisory in nature, if the committee routinely sees concerning incidents and the police department routinely doesn't impose discipline, that would be the kind of thing that this committee could raise as an issue to the city council for further investigation. So it provides that outlet there to guard against any concern that an investigation isn't being properly handled.
Okay. Theme number 8 is communication. Now, this didn't really come out of my review of the emails, but through some conversations I had throughout the past couple of months. And when the police chief responded, Chief Psychos responded in writing to inquiries received this summer regarding the city's departmental policies. I noticed many people were pleased to learn that the policies of the police department already address some of these concerns. Therefore, the feedback I received from them at that point was this feedback that the police department needs to do a more effective job of communicating with underrepresented populations in the city. Now, interestingly enough, I could go over this because I know this is an issue that's near and dear to the city council's heart because it's one of your goals, not related just to policing in Ames, but how we reach all segments of this community with the work that the council does to get input and feedback on your important work. So you'll notice that my recommendation, number 17 on page 39 is, you know that the council has been working with a class at the Iowa State University Community and Regional Planning class that's working on various techniques for communicating with our residents. They're trying to establish and catalog what the most effective techniques are, with a special emphasis on how we reach out to the underrepresented populations in the city of Ames. So we hope to get that information back by the end of this semester, and if everything turns out all right, we'll be dealing with a second class in the second semester. So my recommendation 17, the council should know about already, that the city council adopt any city council approved recommendations from the Iowa State Community Regional Planning classes regarding the best communication techniques to reach our underrepresented populations. Now, I had to say adopt the city approved recommendations because I can't tell you what they are right now, and it'd be very difficult to commit that you're going to adopt all of them right now until you see them. But I know there'll be some there that you'll want to pick out and adopt, and that could lead us to become more effective in this regard, which I know you want us to do, not just in policing, but in all the issues that face our citizens out there. And I think there was a recommendation that was made to provide periodic, I'll make a recommendation, and it was suggested to me that the chief of police get more out front with the community and maybe do a better job of communicating activities, current policies, and aspects of the police department that probably aren't known about the city. So we're going to put the police chief out there in many, many ways to communicate with social media, cable television, videos, radios, and other media. So it truly will be the voice of the police department. And then finally, a recommendation will be to refresh the whole police department website to ensure the information is clear, concise, and more user-friendly for our community members. Finally, I know throughout the country, calls are being heard throughout to defund the police department. This call includes a suggestion that savings realized from reducing the department's budget be reallocated to various social service agencies. Programs related to mental health, social work, crisis intervention, homeless, drug prevention and treatment, affordable housing, public transit, before and after school programs, parks and recreation programs, community engagement, food supply programs, and holistic collaborative services. It has also been suggested that the city not purchase nor accept surplus military vehicles for police department use. So I want Deb to go over the budget just to put this in perspective. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding out in the community, the size of the police department's budget, what money is really available there, and also to remind you of the great commitment you've had to social service agency through local option, sales tax funds, and other CDBG funding. So Deb, you want to handle this particular area?
Right. Thanks, Steve, and good evening, Mayor and Council. Just a little budget 101. The city's budget is set up to have 5 program areas, and public safety is one of those areas in which law enforcement falls within. And so for the city's fiscal year 2020-2021 adopted budget, $10,596,148 has been appropriated to the law enforcement program. And this represents about 4% of the city's total budget. We also want to note that 88% of the expenditures in the total law enforcement budget pay for personal services, which includes the salaries and benefits to those who work within the department. There are also costs associated with fleet and vehicle maintenance, insurance. We also have IT and computer expenses included in this budget to help support the services provided by the department, as well as emergency communication functions and administration and records. And so it's a pretty inclusive budget of all of those services that help the police department provide what they need to in the community. I'm going to shift gears a little bit here and talk about the human services side of things, as well as housing. So the city of Ames uses local option sales tax funds to help pay for human service organizations here within the city. And local option sales tax is that 1% tax that is put on most purchased goods and services within the city. And the city council is very involved with directing this funding by setting up funding priorities on an annual basis, and also the mayor appointing volunteers to ASSET, which is our funding collaboration with United Way of Story County, Iowa State University Student Government, Story County, and then of course the city of Ames. So we have volunteers that work on organizing, looking at the services, reviewing budgets, meeting with agencies, writing reports, and then reviewing outcomes that meet the measures that City Council is most interested in. And the council has provided substantial funding for these agencies over the years, and these services are targeted to low and moderate income residents in the community. In fiscal year 2020-21, this current fiscal year, the funding for these agencies from the city allocation alone is $1,524,850. In addition to the city's commitment to fund human services, the other funders make up the difference of $3,010,453 for a collective total of $4,535,303 for all these agencies. We have about 32 agencies in the process that provide over 100 services. And so this $4.45 million goes towards funding those services and supporting those agencies. The kinds of services that council has prioritized are childcare, food pantries, housing, transportation, sheltering, disaster response, youth development services, and legal assistance. And those are services across the board that these agencies provide and report outcomes on. And we also have home health assistance and domestic violence services, which can involve the police depending on the types of calls that they're receiving. In addition to the funding that goes towards asset, City Council directed all community development block grant funds and home program funding received this fiscal year to go towards a new housing subdivision on 321 State Avenue. So that's what the public might remember this as, is 321 State Avenue. And in this new housing subdivision, there'll be multiple family housing units as well as single family homes that will meet the needs of low and moderate income residents here in Ames. In fiscal year 21, the total of this funding is $826,442. Shifting gears, we're going to talk a little bit about the efforts that the police department has been involved with other community groups, as well as addressing the various types of calls that they respond to. So for several years, the police department has been trying to reduce the officer involvement in some nuisance and social problems. There are several nuisance regulations in Ames that don't rise to the level of crimes, but traditionally have been handled by the police. For example, officers are no longer making contacts on noise complaints where no violations exist. Instead, these complaints are being referred to apartment managers or property management owners to address directly with their tenants. Or in the case of a neighborhood, it may be the neighbors who have called to complain, and the police are asking if the neighbors address it directly with the individual or the individuals that they are complaining about. So we are trying to really help people hold others accountable and offer that support. The police department has also limited its response to calls of the smell of marijuana, instead referring those kinds of calls to apartment managers and owners. And they're also looking at evaluating the issuance of no trespass orders and determining whether or not these are handled better by a civil infraction versus involving a police officer. So again, really trying to refocus where they need to be intervening and put other supports and other things in place to address these calls that come in. Earlier, we had Chief Huff mention that the officers go through mental health first aid training. We think that's great. We think that's a great first step in helping to understand the types of calls that officers may receive. And for several years now, the city's been participating in some collaborations with local agencies that address mental health and criminal justice issues. And they're also involved with a newly developed drug diversion program called Alternatives. This program is to divert non-violent offenders with drug addictions from the criminal justice system to the services that they need. And so we have law enforcement representation from all agencies in Story County, including the Ames Police Department, that are on this drug diversion team. And so it's relationships like this that help pull this community together and interact and communicate to help address the best outcomes possible for the citizens that we're serving. So those are just two examples of collaborations that the Ames Police Department is involved with. Additionally, to help address mental health and special needs calls, the police department has employed a mental health advocate for the past 7 years. This position is currently a 3/4 time position, and the individual evaluates the police calls for service and identifies those that have a mental health component. That mental health advocate then sends the information out to an email distribution list that contains many of the nonprofits and mental health care professionals here within the county to keep the lines of open communication, to let those practitioners and those agencies know that there was a mental health call on an individual. The mental health advocate ensures that those with mental health conditions are receiving the proper services. She works with their families to navigate the criminal justice system as well as the mental health system. And the mental health advocate also works closely with the police officers, is a member of both the wellness and the peer support team. So just a very key position to have within the police department that serves as that conduit between the department and those out in the community that need the most help with mental health. Police department is frequently called out to calls that have this mental health component, but it's not most appropriate for a police officer to be showing up at the person's doorstep. So within the past, I believe it's about 3 years, the police department has begun diverting mental health calls for service to a new crisis mobile response team. And this is a relatively new service to our area. It's provided by Ball Community Mental Health Services. And this team is made up of 2 individuals who will respond to the call. And if the officer is already there, the officer can leave if there's nothing further that the officer needs to do. And then the mental health professionals can take over with assessing the situation and getting the services in place for the individual. Sometimes it does end up with the person needing to go to the emergency room or being admitted to the behavioral health unit. But again, I think this helps free up the time of the officer and puts the individual in need in the best situation possible with the mental health professionals responding to the call. Right now, it's taking the response team about 45 minutes to arrive once a call is made. And I know that Chief Huff is in communication with trying to work through some ways of reducing that response time. Sometimes by the time the team gets there, maybe the crisis has settled down. Other times it hasn't, but it does free up the officer then to move on to the next call they need to take or other business they need to take care of. The mental health advocate works very closely with this response team and helps them that information about crisis incidents and residents with mental health issues who have encountered law enforcement. And I think it just serves as that conduit to help keep our local network of services in place and help deliver those services to people who are in need. So I think the training that's out there and the agencies that feel comfortable contacting the police and bringing the police to their organizations, it just bridges that communication and strengthens that partnership. Lastly, and this gets to the comment that Steve made earlier about the surplus military vehicles. The Ames Police Department does not currently have any surplus military vehicles. Up until about 2003, we did own a surplus military ambulance that was converted to transport officers to incidents, but that vehicle has been replaced with a more effective civilian vehicle for that purpose. So we no longer have the military ambulance within our possession. And that is what I have. I'll turn it back over to Steve.
Okay, so I just want to reiterate that over 88% of the law enforcement budget, the $10 million, $10.6 million, is earmarked towards pay and benefits. So it's my professional opinion that any substantial redirection of funding out of this budget would have to come from personal services, which will reduce the number of officers and thereby severely impact the city's ability to provide adequate service to the community. In this regard, I do have on page 42 two recommendations. First, recommendation 20. I would support a policy adopted by the city council that requires that no surplus armored military vehicles may be purchased or even accepted by the city for its use. And secondly, number 21, and lastly, if the city council wishes to do so, the allocation of our asset funds could be prioritized in the next budget cycle and concentrated in human services that better meet the city council's social justice goals. Okay? So I want to thank council for your patience as we went over this. I can assure you that staff reviewed the information supplied by our citizens. I think we clearly understand and listened to what people said. And we believe the sum total of these 21 recommendations will be a significant and appropriate step forward in policing for the police department and appropriate for this community. So with that, I'll end our presentation and see if you have any questions before you open it up to the public.
Okay, council, do you have any questions for staff on any of the things that were presented this evening?
Mayor, I have a couple of questions, and maybe it's just that I missed something when my sound went out there briefly. One of those questions is for Jeff. And as I understand it, well, I know we've had some calls for changes in the way in which we handle those complaints against officers and officers who are being accused of significant infractions. And we've been asked, why do we have to pay them administrative leave? Why can't we just put them on leave and not pay them? Or why can't we fire them immediately? And I didn't catch that you said anything about that, but again, my sound was on and off a bit there.
So the Peace Officer Bill of Rights, union contracts, and some other laws wouldn't allow for that. So for due process reasons, in the process of investigation, we're not able to make very quick, rash decisions. We can put an officer on administrative leave with pay while we conclude our investigation, but it's just not allowed by law to fire somebody immediately before those due process rights kind of kick in.
Mark might want to speak to that because I think there's been a Supreme Court case for all city employees. We have to have a predetermination.
Yeah, that's true, Steve. That there's a U.S. Supreme Court case from years ago that set out due process rights for government employees, and so any government employee has the right to due process, and that means that you can't just fire them on the spot, that you have to go through a process with a hearing. So usually the way that's handled then is to, if you want them out of the building, out of the workplace, to put them on administrative leave until that hearing can take place.
And you have to do it with pay. Do it without pay would be a determination of wrongdoing before it's been established, right?
Yes, yeah. And as Jeff noted, police officers have extra protection under the law.
Is that an Iowa Supreme Court or is that a U.S. Supreme Court?
U.S. Supreme Court.
Thank you.
Mark, you might as well stay on because this question is, I think, both for you and Jeff. Last night at the NAACP meeting, it came to our attention that the president's new executive order from September 22nd is now impacting federal government contractors and grant recipients. And that executive order focuses on training for implicit bias and some other trainings. That there's a rather detailed description of the sort of training that's involved. but that these organizations that impose that training on their employees may not be eligible to be federal contractors or may have their funding cut. Do you know if that impacts us? And if you don't, is it something that could be looked into before our next discussion of this report, so we have some sense of where we stand in relation to that executive order?
First of all, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, what I know about that is just what I've heard in the media. And but I can certainly look into it. I know I ran into someone from Iowa State that does diversity training there, and I know they were looking at that and how it was going to impact them. And we just ran into them at the grocery store the other night, and they were telling me about that. So it's certainly an issue, but I haven't received anything on that from the national sources that send me emails on things. But I will look into that and get back to everyone on that.
Thank you.
Anything else, Gloria?
I think that's it for now, unless something comes up when other people are asking questions. Thank you.
Anybody else?
So I have a question on the transparency section. So the recommendations state that we'll publish breakdowns of race and other demographics where known. And I think that's partially because we don't want officers to make assumptions about people's demographics. But could we make it a requirement of the Ames PD to ask that question of everyone with the ability to opt out, so we have better statistics instead of just not asking at all?
Might ask Mark about that. Let's give us some direction on that. A voluntary, a question, they can choose to or not participate. You're muted, Mark.
You're muted, Mark.
You're muted.
Mark, you got to start all over again. You're muted.
Thank you. Okay, Rachel, could you state your question again? I actually started looking up the president's executive order.
Yeah,
so I didn't hear your question.
So we want to publish more breakdowns of race and other demographics where known, but that's just basically because we don't want officers to make assumptions about people's demographics. Could we make it a Ames PD policy to ask people for their demographic information with an opt-out, of course?
I'd want to put some serious thought into that and some research. Off the top of my head, I don't like the idea of doing that for a few reasons, but that's something I can look into and give you an opinion. But I almost hate to opine on that just off the top of my head without doing a little research. But my knee-jerk reaction is kind of like, I'm not sure we should be asking people those sort of things. I think there may be sort of negative consequences to doing that.
Well, you look into it for the council, all right?
Yeah, I'll look into it.
Okay, sounds good.
Anybody else?
I do have a question about Lexipol. I think it's valuable to have professional advice on technical topics and to be aware of national developing trends and best practices and case law. But my question is, I guess I don't know anything about the marketplace for those sorts of services. So those of you who do know, is there anything in the competition to Lexipol that is sort of qualitatively understandable that could rise to a council level decision? Is this something that we should be looking at, whether one of the competitors would be a better fit for Ames? Or does it seem like you're familiar with the market and this is pretty firmly the best recommendation you have? Perhaps it's maybe too technical for us to undertake anyway.
One thing I could offer with that is Lexipol was recommended by our insurance carrier, by ICAP. And that's why they offer the grant to help pay a portion of the fee that we're charged for using Lexipol. So our insurance carrier, at least, is comfortable enough with them to make that recommendation. But there are others out there.
I believe we did go to the city council with this Alexa poll, or we budgeted for it. We'll have to check with our contract when we could change over.
Sure.
And do we start over with that? Do we lose everything, or is it a whole different system? I don't know, but I don't think we're bound for them forever. But I think whether you have faith in them or not, we should give you a little more report on them if there's a concern about them, particularly.
I guess I personally am not that aware, but I have heard some community concern, and I just don't know how to evaluate it. I think that
we could certainly follow up on that concern.
Sure. Okay, I'll just leave it there. I would be interested in hearing whether this is the sort of thing that would be appropriate for council to evaluate, or whether it's fundamentally more of a technical thing. Thanks.
Other questions for staff?
I had a question about the body cameras that were discussed earlier. So I know there was like the list of when they have to turn the body cameras on, but how are they actually like held accountable for if they turn those on or not? And like who's like in charge of that? And then if they don't turn them on in the appropriate situations, how is that taken up with them?
So yeah, there's a list of things where the officer should turn the body cameras on. We do have the capacity with our system to go back and do what's called record after the fact. So it's pretty technical, but the cameras are actually always recording. And the only information that's dumped into the system is when the officer hit the record button, and then it would dump that stuff into the system. The other stuff stays on the recorder. And so if an officer did forget to turn on their camera, there is a way to go back and get that information. We've used it a few times when officers have simply forgotten to turn on their camera and they wish that they had. So that is a possibility. But also discipline can play a part in this. If officers were to routinely not turn on their camera when required, that would be an issue that we would deal with progressive discipline. However, that's not been a problem. Our officers have been using the body-worn cameras. The other thing is they do fail from time to time. They're an electronic piece of equipment, and they're not perfect. And we have had some incidents where the unit itself has failed. There's also times when officers are working long shifts and the battery fails before the end of the shift. So it's our intent to record as much as we can. I think our officers have been very compliant, but there are times that it's not perfect and some things aren't recorded. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks.
Jeff, would you also just comment on, I think when police were developing policy on body cameras, because I know that you spent a lot of time on that to make sure there wasn't an abuse of privacy. Are there times where not the police officer, but a member of the general public requests that the camera be turned off?
Yeah, you're correct. We spent a lot of time looking at different policies before we adopted our body-worn camera policy. And we did hear some concerns from the public about the recordings and privacy. So there are some times when we could turn the camera off. Those are more likely to happen. I'll give you an example. Maybe an officer goes out to take a report of a burglary at a private residence, and maybe the victim may say, I'd rather you not walk around my entire house and record everything. And if that's appropriate, there's no evidentiary value to it. They can turn off the camera, but they do have to justify the reasoning. And so they may make a statement before turning off their camera that they're turning it off at the request of that person. But as a general rule, it's not up to the people that are being recorded to decide what's recorded. It's up to the officer to decide. But there are limited circumstances when they could turn off the camera at request. But we have to be pretty careful with those.
Thank you. Other questions?
Mayor, I had one more question that comes from an email that we received, and I think maybe this is for Steve. The question arose about whether we would be doing or should be doing an equity audit for either the police department or all city departments. And I'm wondering if that's the sort of thing we're anticipating probably coming out of our work with National League of Cities and REAL, or have we talked about that at all in the organization?
No, we haven't. Well, I'm not discounting it, just haven't talked about it yet. Whether it comes out in the National League of Cities work, I don't know.
Thanks.
I just have a quick question for Jeff. I know that we covered some of the training that the officers go through as it relates to de-escalation and bias and those sorts of subjects, but can you, and it doesn't have to be an exhaustive list, but could you just maybe give a ballpark of maybe the number of hours annually that officers spend in all types of training? Because I think there's some misconceptions about ongoing education.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. So there's some state mandated training that all officers are required to complete every year. And so that's kind of a baseline. So there's some firearms training that has to be completed every year, defensive tactics training that has to be completed every year. There's medical, so CPR, first aid. We try and get everybody up to speed on mental health first aid, which I know is in this list, but it's an important one. So there are those kind of things. But then we have a lot of training that officers go to at their own request. So there's schools that go on all over Iowa where an officer may be more interested in a certain area and they want to get more information about it. And so they will request to go to training, whether sometimes it's at the Iowa Law Enforcement Academy and sometimes somewhere else. So I can't give you a perfect number because actually every officer is going to be different in the number of hours they receive every year. But I think and I wish I had it in front of me, but I know there's a state minimum. It's 12 or 16, I think, but we go over that. Almost every officer goes over that every year, just because of those other training sessions that they might want to go to. And our officers, especially our younger officers, they love to go to training and they go a lot. And outside of COVID-19, we always had somebody gone for something. We've done a lot more online training over this last 6 months to try and still keep up to speed. And our training budget is usually sufficient to make sure that all officers are up to speed. And then we've got specialty training too. We've got all of our instructors. So while we have certified instructors in some of the areas in the report, we also have certified firearms instructor, DT instructors, crime scene, you name it. So there's a lot of training that goes on all the time at the police department. Thank you.
Tim?
Yes, we talked a bit about this when we were going through this previously, but just could you clarify what prevents an officer who has been discharged in another police department, either in Iowa or in another state, has had bad behavior? What prevents us from missing that and hiring that person who's had bad behavior?
Thanks for asking that. So we have a very thorough background process, and we have a lot of tools at our disposal to do these background investigations. And that would include everywhere that one of our prospective employees has ever lived and ever worked. And so part of that process will be going back and making sure that we've accounted for every place someone has lived and every job that they've ever held. And I can say with a pretty high level of confidence that if someone has been discharged or fired from another agency, we are going to find out about it, even if they don't want us to find out about it. I know how thorough our background investigations are. We are often complimented by other agencies about how thorough that is. And that's why it takes us the 4 to 6 weeks to get through just the first part of the background. So I would hope that you're confident as I am that we're not going to hire somebody else's problem here at the Ames Police Department. And we have uncovered those before. We have had candidates going through our process that we found out the reason that they were looking for employment elsewhere is because they were no longer welcome at the agency they used to be at. So we picked up on it.
Other questions?
We talked a little bit about if an officer has a complaint issued against them, the rights that the officer has, but are there any rights for the citizen that made the complaint to the police department? Like outlined rights, kind of like in the report.
I think a little bit, but part of what we talk about is in our policy when we have a complaint is that we do have a requirement that we get back in touch with the complainant. So initial interview by a supervisor to get the facts and circumstances of the case and start their investigation. But we're also required to follow back up with the person that made the complaint to make sure that they understand the outcome of the complaint. Otherwise, they would have any rights that anybody else would have when, when we're conducting any investigation.
Thanks.
I had a question about the ACPAC. So I know like the selection of who's going to be on that is super important, and that it needs to like represent everybody in our community. And students are a really large part of our community here in Ames. So how are we going to involve students and make sure that they are involved in that commission, and like just make sure that that commission is fully representative of our entire community, including the students here in Ames?
Well, that'll be a good discussion for the city council because they're going to be the ones who actually make the appointment. So there'll be discussions on that, I'm sure.
I might just comment too, Nicole, that on the basis that council move forward on that, as Brian indicated, there's a lot of conversation that'll be at the council level because this will become part of an ordinance, setting this up. And so there'll be discussion in terms of what that makeup's going to be. And I think at that point in time, we stipulate you might have at least one student or maybe two students, on there. And as council has seen over the last couple of years in the appointments that I've been endeavoring to bring to council to approve, really seeking to get diversity, a good cross-section across the community on our boards and commissions, and that includes students also. It's a good question, good point. I wrote that down. It'll be something to discuss as we if it moves on the basis it moves forward.
Since
Jeff,
go
ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, since Nicole mentioned the ACPAC, Jeff, do you want to say something about the police officers' response to that suggestion in this report and how they viewed that recommendation?
Absolutely. I did go over this report with our officers over the past few days so that there weren't any surprises in there for them as well. And of all the recommendations, that's probably the one that stands out the most. And what I can tell you, first of all, is I would have done something like that anyway. I think it's important to have a citizen perspective in the police department so that we can get people that don't look at every incident like a police officer does, and they can give us some input. So absent this report, I would have done some kind of advisory committee anyway to start with. But when we took this idea to the officers, I think they saw it for exactly what it is too, is it's an opportunity to have that citizen input into our processes. And I think they're very open to it. They enjoy a lot of things at the police department, but one they enjoy the most is our Citizens Police Academy, when they get to interact with citizens and show them how we do things, why we do things, and see some people get their eyes opened a little bit that didn't understand some of these concepts before. And I think a part of this committee will be training. They'll have to receive some training in police procedures and contemporary law enforcement and the law and all that. And they'll be very excited to be able to interact with this new committee and provide that. So they were all very supportive, not only of this part of the recommendations, but I think all of the recommendations.
Jeff, when you're talking about use of force, I think there was one statistic that was interesting. Can you just talk about how many times officers displayed a firearm? And I think that was in 2019, and maybe just comment on that in general.
Yes, I am just going back to the report to make sure I get the numbers correct.
Page 12.
12. Okay. So as we said before, we had 117 incidents of use of force in 2019. And I think what you were asking is we had 22 incidents where an officer displayed a firearm, but we didn't have any incidents where an officer shot a firearm. So some of those incidents could be simple ones like a building clearing. We got an alarm that goes off. The officers may clear the building, and sometimes they may do it with a firearm. So they would list that out. So it may sound high, but it really isn't all that high. Just the display of a firearm could mean you just got the shotgun out of the car. Hopefully that's what you were asking.
It is, and then would that be? I know you've been with the department for a long time. Would that be a typical representation over the past few years in terms of? It appears to be a fairly low quantity of incidents, and also with no shots being fired, even whether it involves people or not. You know, instead of building clearing, for example, that would seem to be reassuring also.
Yeah, I would think that's pretty typical.
Okay, other questions for staff at this point?
I have one more question. So it was mentioned that the department still uses polygraph testing. And I know polygraph testing has come under like a lot of criticism, as long as like other lie detector tests, for a lot of racial bias, because it's kind of up to the examiner to decide on those results. So how do you use polygraph testing without, or just make sure you're not including racial biases during those tests?
So I would say the polygraph is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. And so we don't make any decisions based on any one test within our system. So our polygrapher is looking for integrity and honesty within that, regardless of race or anything else. And we take those results, and we also look at that through our MMPI and our clinical exam with our psychologist. So what I can tell you is it's just never one thing that it might disqualify anybody. It all has to be verified. And so I would hope that those kind of things aren't creeping into a polygraph, but I do like the tool because sometimes it does give us some information we might not get otherwise, and we can use that throughout the process, and we still have to verify it.
The polygraph test is not just for bias, though. Is that correct? Are you looking for patterns of inconsistency or the not being truthful in other aspects? Is that correct, Jeff? Or how is it used, or what subjects are covered?
Yeah, well, they're partially looking for criminal activity, but they are looking for consistency within answers. And so the part of that test is asking, I don't want to get too technical, but asking the same question a number of different ways just to show that there's consistency in the answers. Again, it's not really like a pass-fail, and it's probably nothing like what you see on TV when you see a polygraph. But it does sometimes give you some information that you can follow up on. And I don't want to say we ever use just those results and do anything. It's a part of this much bigger puzzle that we got to put together.
All right, any last questions for staff? Okay, before we go into public comment, let's just take a short break, anticipating there's going to be a number of people that want to address council. So let's just take a 5-minute break, and we will resume again at around 8:08 or 8:09. So we'll see you in a few minutes. Thank you. Open up public comment this evening, and I just want to make a few comments before we get started. And first of all, I think that sometimes people wonder why council members' video goes on and off at times, and some of our council members have some issues with their internet fluctuating, and they had some problems even today. We had a little bit of conversation about that, and so it's my understanding that they turn the video off, they can still get the audio stream. So it's not that people are just checking out; it's just more or less they're trying to make sure that they maintain a consistent, they hear what's being said. So it's not that they're just interested or going off and doing other things around their house. So I just want to make people be aware of that. So, secondly, I want to make the comment that council sincerely values public input, whether it's tonight or by email going forward. As has been mentioned before, there'll be no decisions made this evening. And so consequently, our ears remain open, door remains open to offer public comments. So if you don't feel comfortable doing it this evening, or you can't get it done within a 3-minute time slot, you're invited to do that in that way. So tonight, public comments, an opportunity to offer input on the staff report contents or identifying a subject or issue that may not have been covered in that report. Public comment is not a two-way conversation between staff, council, and or the person who is offering input. You really want to make sure we hear what you have to say. Speakers are certainly welcome to pose questions, and at council discretion, the questions that were posed may be directed to staff to respond to either at the conclusion of the meeting tonight or potentially at a later date. So here's some of the protocols that we have followed previously, and some may not have had the opportunity to participate previously. I just kind of review those so we're all on the same page. First of all, prior to offering any comments, each speaker shall clearly state their name, their street address, and if you're not an Ames resident, what city you're from. And that's for official records purposes. That goes into the minutes. And Aaron, who is taking minutes tonight, will be recording those. And if the speaker is officially representing a group or an organization, you're welcome to state that also. Failure for anyone to personally identify themselves and just going on in the comments will cause them to be muted. And if they refuse to identify, they'll just forfeit their opportunity to offer comments. It's very important. Secondly, each speaker has the opportunity to address council once during each meeting on a topic. So it's not a repeat. So please make sure you try and get your comments in your allotted time. Each person will be allowed up to 3 minutes to offer their comments. And you need to conclude your comments by the end of the time period. At the end of that time period, you will be muted, allowing the next speaker to proceed. And what we've done is, for the first time tonight, just so everyone sees what's going on, Brian, who's going to be, who's the moderator, will have a timer. And the timer will start after you introduce yourself. And so you can kind of be aware of how much time you have left. We did anticipate that maybe a lot of public comments, and so we want to make sure we give everyone the opportunity to give input and have an equal amount of time to give the input to council. Public comment tonight will not be allowed on any encounters or incidents people might have had with the police department or staff. Those wishing to discuss or review those issues, you're invited to contact the chief of police, the city manager, the Ames Human Relations Commission by phone or email. And in fact, theme number 7, which was talked about tonight, the ACPAC, is another way in which council, if they approve moving forward with this, be an opportunity to get that information and encourage transparency. Also, and this probably goes without saying, but any verbal accusations or attacks on any city staff or department are using objectionable or inappropriate language will result in the speaker being immediately muted and forfeiting the opportunity to address council during the public comment tonight. So, and the last point is that if someone else has already made comments that you were going to make, you're certainly welcome to address council, but we just encourage you to indicate that you agree with a prior person's comments, and then please offer some new or fresh comments that you think are important and germane. So that said, we're going to let Brian, we'll go ahead and call out. And Brian, why don't you review also how individuals can go ahead and, if they're on the phone, how they can go ahead and access it. And also those that are on Zoom, the process that you're going to go through to call on them.
Sure. Anyone wishing to speak can indicate so by raising their hand on the Zoom app if they're joining us by web. If you are on the phone with us, you can press *9 on your phone, and that will show us that your hand is raised, and I'll unmute you one by one. And so if we're ready to begin, I'll start with the first speaker, Ahmed Ismail. Ahmed, you can go ahead, unmute yourself, and begin your comments.
I'm not popping up in the actual Zoom, but I just want to confirm, can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Ahmed. Thank you.
Okay. And then I thought the timer was going to start after I introduce myself.
Oh, Brian, yeah, actually, would you please restart it after they introduce themselves? We'll want 3 minutes for public comment.
Yeah. All right. So hello, everyone. My name is Ahmed Ismail. I'm an industrial engineering student here at Iowa State University and one of the organizers for Ames BLM. I am originally born and raised in Sudan and moved to Iowa City about 10 to 12 years ago. So I had a couple things I want to touch on.
Ahmed, can you give us a street address, please?
Yeah, I don't feel comfortable giving out a street address. So is it okay if I just say I'm from Iowa City? Because that's originally where I'm from.
I'm sorry, from Iowa State or Iowa City?
Iowa City.
Okay, thank you. All right.
All right, yeah, so I had a lot I want to address, but due to the fact that there's only 3 minutes, I'm going to try to keep it short. So I really want to just kind of focus on a couple things. First and foremost, I think there's a huge need for equity review board. I really want to echo what Ms. Gloria just said, due to the fact that you really do need an outside perspective on these issues, due to the fact that a lot of these issues we speak on are really affecting marginalized communities, and no one on the city council or on anyone, majority of people that are involved in this process are not from these communities. Furthermore, when we're talking about engaging with these communities in communication, a lot of these communities do not have the time to fill out your surveys. Low-income communities are hurting today. They don't have time to worry about tomorrow, right? If you're in a low-income community, you're probably having a low-income job, which means it's more physically demanding compared to someone that earns a higher income, which requires more strategy work rather than actual physical labor. And once you do that and you come home, you probably have your kids to worry about. So you probably don't have 3-4 hours of your day to come here and then, sit through all this just to give 3 minutes of input. And you understand that your problems range for much more than a 3-minute conversation. So the changes that are being made are slow, and the issue is they're hurting today and they can't wait for tomorrow. So they typically don't have the time to give their input. So a lot of the input that we did see did cover some things, but at the same time, the discussion needs to be furthered. So I think there's a huge need to bring in an outside perspective, whether it's Ames BLM, NAACP, or the NLC themselves, and do some of that work right there. So I think that's huge. So a lot of the things that were addressed, I think one of the things that was brought up when it came to organizational culture as well as officer requirements was the implementation of the Intercultural Development Inventory, the IDI. A huge issue with that is it's a very good measurement, yes. However, it's solely dependent on the honesty of the person taking it, because in reality, all it does is pretty much just ask the same question in 50 different ways and pretty much just ask, hey, is this culture better than this culture? Is this culture better than this culture? And anyone that says, nope, they're just different, is the person that ranks in adaptation versus denial, right? And you have an easier time pretty much passing basic math than you would if you understood that basic philosophy. So the issue with that is it's really dependent on the honesty. And another thing with the review board is I think it's a huge issue that it's going to be something where it's going to be appointed by actual city council members. I think it's something that should be community involvement, and they should actually have real power, like subpoena power to be able to actually police the police, because at the end of the day, that's what the need is. If we look at the historical, like the history of these institutions, right? Like the police badge itself, if you looked at what that looked like a couple 100 years ago. It looked the exact same. Instead of gold, it was silver, and instead of saying police, it says slave patrol, right? So that history is a lot of people do not know that, and that's something that's really huge. So when we talk about the need for change, we really have to further this discussion outside of that. So I think for that Citizens Review Board, we should allow organizations such as the NAACP, Youth Shelter Services, and communities and organizations that do the work with the marginalized communities themselves to be the ones that have the say in who's actually on those committees, and they should have real power. And particularly, they should also have the power to have that body cam footage whenever they call on it without any hurdles to actually do the review work they need to do.
Ahmed, before you drop off, I have one question, if you would. You said the IDA, was this IDI? This is regarding the officer interview or selection process. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, that's something that's correct. I myself have taken it twice. It's solely just dependent on your honesty and what you perceive. There's not necessarily a way of saying this person was honest. And if you just understand the fact that if you say, hey, this is not better or worse, it's just different, because that's what cultures are. They're not necessarily better or worse than each other. They're just different. That itself is what ranks you in adaptation. So there's a couple stages. You have denial, you have polarization, I think, and then after that is minimization, then acceptance and adaptation. So as you move to the right, it means you pretty much are more accepting of other cultures. But if you simply just understand that philosophy and how the exam works alone, and you just say, hey, it's different on every single question, you can easily get a score that puts you much higher than you actually are. But it's dependent on your own honesty in regards to what you think.
Okay. And Jeff, do you understand what his point is on the Jeff Huff? Yeah, you're shaking your head. Yes, so you understand what his point is. Okay. And so, one more last question, if I might. I think I heard you advocating that this review for the review board, but having NAACP, BLM, or other organizations help in the selection process. Is that what you said?
So my concern there with the need for an equity review board is, if you look at this board right now, it's pretty much just all white, right? At the end of the day, marginalized communities are typically not white communities unless a white person lives in a low-income community, right? It's typically like for you could go your whole day without being the only person that looks like you in a room. You go to work, everyone looks like you. You go to a grocery store, everyone looks like you. It extends to even our, political system, whereas the majority of people in politics look like you. 95% senior leadership at Fortune 500 companies is white men. They look like you, right? Typically, those are not the people that have the issues. You need to talk to marginalized communities because no one understands the problem than the person that actually experiences it. So bringing in a person or organization such as the NLC or NAACP or BLM really does give you a perspective and a better understanding of what those problems are, as well as what solutions they'd like to see. Because at the end of the day, it's simple as going on a mission trip and saying, oh, here's your problem within this community. I'm going to drop it off and I'm going to leave.
Okay, thank you. Ryan, next person.
The next speaker is Sarah Carney.
Hello, can you hear me?
Can, Sarah.
Hi, my name is Sarah Carney. I live at 320 South 2nd Street. While I understand the efforts to address individual racial bias of officers, it's important to understand that policing in America is inherently unjust, and that true justice can't come until systemic racism is dismantled. I support a careful defunding of police and reallocation of resources to groups designed to handle them. If we want to reduce houselessness, let's provide housing. If we want to reduce substance abuse, let's address the root cause and provide treatment. If we want to administrate traffic laws, let's create a system of unarmed traffic clerks. If we want someone having a mental health crisis to have support, let's get them support. If we treat an encounter like a criminal encounter, it's more likely to become one. Police officers can't reasonably be trained to respond properly to a wide variety of regulatory and crisis situations, so we shouldn't keep forcing it just because it's how it's always been done. I call on the City of Ames to continue to quickly divert these responsibilities from police to other agencies and work to end the social and economic barriers that cause so many to struggle. An external advisory council that can't enforce their rulings and lacks transparency isn't much more than a symbol. So I encourage the council to ensure the advisory council has real power. I do recall a Visha riot where chemical munitions were deployed, which caused people sleeping in Farley Hall to be woken up choking. So just ban tear gas. I find it frustrating that whenever the community brings forward concerns and pain about how policing affects black and brown people, including disabled black and brown people, the very first thing I hear from university and city leadership are lengthy ways the police are already amazing and already great. That's not how anyone wants to be treated. That's not accountability.
Sarah, I've given you a lot of latitude.
Okay, thanks.
So I'm just asking you. So can you comment specifically? I think I picked out from what you said about banning tear gas, and can you comment specifically? And also, you have some opinions on funding and also funding of other agencies. Can you help us understand what your position would be on that?
I guess I don't really have specifics prepared.
Okay.
I feel like I was fairly specific that if we want to reduce houselessness, let's divert funds to housing. We can't train police to handle all these situations, so we should stop trying. So diverting money away from having police on staff doesn't seem extreme to me. If we're handling these issues with other agencies, then we don't need as many officers. We don't need officers during traffic stops if we have another way to handle traffic regulations. We don't need police handling homelessness calls if we have people in homes.
Okay. All right. Anything else?
I just want to say that I hope that I appreciate that the council is actively listening with this report. Now I ask that we keep going, and this should be considered the beginning and not the end. Let's not pat ourselves on the back until we've really improved life in Ames for our black and brown neighbors and reduce police interactions and reduce their power in our town. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
The next speaker is Taylor Junk. Taylor, you can unmute yourself and begin your comments.
Hi, I'm Taylor Junk. My address is 916 Vermont Circle, Ames, Iowa, 50014. Thank you for putting the energy into this and for being willing to recommend changes. However, we know that past issues with police accountability have been due to a lack of transparency, lack of disciplinary action within the department, police investigating themselves, police union policies such as qualified immunity, and organizations such as Lexipol that aim to decrease lawsuits against police, not necessarily aiming to provide the best public policy. This does not lead to justice for victims or the overall safety of our community. I do have many questions left unanswered with this report. To start, what city services do armed police officers currently offer that could be provided without any guns or shifted to other departments? 88% of the police budget is personnel, that was previously mentioned tonight. Do these individuals need to be housed in the police department and under the police union as officers, or could we have mental health advocates, crisis responders, traffic responders, etc., that are not armed PD? 82% of activities expenditures are spent on patrolling. What are the reductions in violent crime that we're gaining from these patrols per year? For a cost of $6 million every year, there should be a considerable gain in safety. Another question I have are there quotas in Ames for traffic stops? In terms of funding, I urge you not to reprioritize within asset social services. That division needs more funding in itself, which requires divesting from other parts of the budget, including the police department. The 2020 city budget allocated over $10 million to law enforcement, and the asset funds is allocated less than $4.5 million for such a large plethora of social services that they enact. Specifically for the police department, what solutions can you come up with for crowd control other than chemical weapons and use of force against citizens with batons? What options do civilians have to hold the police department accountable for bodily damage sustained during crowd control? I also urge you to reduce the scope of police unions in Ames to bargaining for wages and hours, not for disciplinary action within the department. And lastly, these 8 can't wait policies that were talked about seem to be common sense in decreasing violence against the community, and yet they've not even been fully adopted by Ames. However, I don't think that these are the solution. These policies existed in Minneapolis and did not prevent the death of George Floyd, which sparked these discussions that are long overdue. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Taylor.
The next speaker is Sabah Fahim.
Hello? Seba, can you unmute yourself? We can't hear you yet. All right, Brian, let's just go ahead and, Seba, if you could kind of work on your connection, and then we will come back and pick you up a little later on. Go ahead, Brian, next person.
The next speaker is Deborah Fink.
Deborah Fink, 222 South Russell in Ames.
Thank you.
You noted that Ames doesn't use any surplus military vehicles now. I wondered if there's what other military equipment that is used, surplus military equipment is used besides vehicles. That's all.
Thank you.
The next speaker is Philip Gassman.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Can, Philip.
Okay, so my name is Philip Gassman. I live at 1605 Burnett Avenue in Ames. I first of all just want to thank our police department for the work they've been doing, continue to do. I thank you for this in-depth report that City Manager Schenker and Commander Huff and others have been engaged in. I think it is a really in-depth piece of work, and personally, I'm quite impressed with all the different layers of checks and balances that are in the department. And in general, I'm just thankful for all the work that the city does. I do want to read from a Newsweek. This is posted online. These are Gallup poll results that occurred from June 23rd to July 6th. They surveyed more than 36,000 adults. They found that 61% of Black Americans said they'd like police to spend the same amount of time in their community, while 20% answered they'd like to see more police, totaling 81%. Just 19% of those polled said they wanted police to spend less time in their area. Black Americans' responses to the question were nearly on par with the national average, in which 67% of all U.S. adults said they wanted police presence to remain the same, and 19% said they wanted it to increase. So I believe that the majority of people in this community and across the nation do not favor defunding the police, in contrast to some of the opinions already voiced here, and of course, voiced widely in the media, much of which has led to, I think, some very violent kinds of reactions across the country that haven't helped anything. There is a plethora of issues, but a lot of the comments that are made about, oh, we can shift this to this kind of funding to deal with this kind of problem, I don't believe these have been thought out well at all. And it sounds good on the surface, perhaps, but I think if we dig into it further, we'll find out that much of it isn't really logical or really justified. It may be that there are some functions police do that could be better done by some other kinds of agencies, but that would take some thinking. And in general, I'd say we really need to be careful about how we go about these things. So thank you for letting me share here, and thank you for all the efforts that all of you are doing.
Thank you, Philip. Can you circle back, Brian, and see if Ames can come back on again?
I don't see Seba's hand raised, so I wonder if maybe we should give her a few more moments to try to work on the. One alternative might be if there's an issue with the audio connection with the Zoom meeting, it is possible to call the 800 number while you're in the meeting and use that as an alternative, so that
I'm going to get that 800 number, or that toll-free number again for him.
I don't have it in front of me. I'm sorry.
I do have it. It's 888-475-4499. And I believe you have to enter in the Zoom meeting number, which is 826-593-023. And that information can also be found on our on the cityofames.org webpage. You go to government, city council meetings, and go to the agenda. All that information is printed right there on the agenda, top of the agenda, so you can use that too. So, okay, Ryan, next person.
The next person to speak is Andrew Meyer.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, Andrew.
My name is Andrew Meyer. I live at 322 11th Street here in Ames.
Thank you.
So I wanted to address 3 points. The first one was, I think Jeff was talking about what the police have been doing as far as outreach, and also some additional proposals included in this outreach. While I think this is a fine idea, I think it's important to remember that so much of this comes down to what the police actually choose to do in the moment. On page 16, you have Ordinance 300.2.1, duty to intercede, and I'm just calling out this one, but the language is in many of the ordinances where it talks about what is reasonable and how the officer is deciding to do what is reasonable. So here it says clearly beyond that which is objectively reasonable. And then later it informs the officer that they're supposed to report it if it's potentially beyond that which is objectively reasonable. So while it's nice that we're making these outreach efforts, at the end of the day, it's going to come down to what the officer's choosing to do. And I also recognize that there's that list of 18 factors, but really, I hope the focus is more on what the police are choosing to do and how they're choosing to do it. The second thing I'd like to touch on was the proposal to ban the use of tear gas. To the best of my memory, I think there have been 2 times in the past several years where tear gas has ever been used. And I think the PDF showed that was kind of a thing we're proud of, but it makes me wonder why we have tear gas at all. The times I'm remembering were involved Visha and a crowd of students down in Campus Town, and the use of the tear gas led to greater problems beyond that, with the tear gas drifting into buildings. And on top of that, page 12 mentions that police officers have only displayed firearms 22 times. Also, that seems like a great thing, but part of it makes me wonder if they even need the firearms in the first place, because they don't seem to need to use them, actually. They only seem to have them there as a threat, but, you know, it seems worrisome to me that, you know, if you're going to draw a firearm, you should be prepared to use it. And they don't seem to need to use it, so I'm not sure why they have them. And the final thing is about body camera footage. What wasn't discussed was the police's policy on what happens to the video after the fact. So what I'd like to know about is how long is video kept after it's been recorded? What can I do if I've been involved in a stop to actually access the video that involves me and see what happens? How much time do I have to get at that video? And if that policy could be produced. I've looked on the police website and I'm not sure I've seen it. So,
Andrew, quick question for you. You talked about the outreach, and you said page 16. Is that the right page number? I'm trying to find.
So I didn't. So, I think, and I apologize if I'm wrong on this, but I think Jeff had talked about what the police were doing as far as outreach, and so I called to page 16 just to note that ordinance, and I apologize. Let me check just a second here.
I just want to make sure we get that recorded and
yeah. So
that's all. It's okay.
I just wanted to call out policy 300.2.1 as kind of showing that.
Say that again, please.
300.2.1.
Okay.
Duty to intercede and report.
Gotcha.
It involves that it's the law enforcement officer's in fact, job to decide what's objectively reasonable. So it's
all right. Very good. Thank you.
The next speaker is Caden.
Hi, my name is Caden Miller, and I live at 330 South 2nd Street. I just wanted to agree with Ahmed, who spoke first from the Ames Black Lives Matter. And I wanted to say that I think that the NAACP and or Black Lives Matter and the community members should have a say in who's on the Citizen Review Board if it goes into policy. I think that is super critical to creating a full diverse group. We've seen issues when the community doesn't have a say with in who's on the committee, in such instances of the renaming of Cat Hall, where people, it can turn into super biased. I said when the community doesn't have say, and when people who are adversely affected by police violence, such as our African American brothers, it could turn very biased and not represent all parts of the community. I heard you guys talk about wanting a diverse board of people on the committee, and for that to happen, we need more people to be able to have a say in who's on that board. That's all I got to say.
Caden, thank you. Was it Lord, Lord, your last name?
O-L-E-R.
O-L-E-R. I'm sorry. My apologies.
You're good.
Thank you.
The next speaker is Riley Drake.
Hi, my name is Riley. Can you hear me?
We can. Hi, Riley. Thank you.
Hi, I live at 3322 Jefferson in Ames.
Thank you.
Yes. I want to address a comment that I can't remember who it was that made it, but he said something along the lines of like, these ideas, these solutions aren't possible, or they're not logical. But if you listen to what Ahmed, Sarah, a number of other people have shared tonight, it's quite clearly inaccurate. There are absolutely ways to make these ideas happen, and there are cities and places across the US that are making that happen. And it's not radical to want to improve society. It shouldn't be. Citizens all over the nation have witnessed huge faults in both the behavior and the impact of police. I belong to an organization called the Anti-Racist Collaborative of Ames. I'm also an Ames community member. And we fully support and are aware of the work that Ames Black Lives Matter is doing in reimagining community safety and striving toward a system that's built on prevention rather than response, starting with abolition of policing. Nationally, 95% of policing is in response to nonviolent events. Iowa's law enforcement and criminal justice system have become the primary response to community issues for which criminalization can't solve. I echo Ahmed, Sarah, who have said these same things. These include temporary chronic issues such as houselessness, domestic violence, addiction, mental health crises, among other structural inequities. Finding a better way to protect citizens is part of an evolving society. Law enforcement should not be out of bounds of this evolution, and law enforcement has proven to be ill-suited for a number of the calls received. How can we justify the manner in which police currently exist? That's my question to you all.
Thank you.
The next speaker is Tim Sklenar.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Tim.
Yeah, it's Sklenar, but Sklenar's close enough. I live at 320 South 2nd Street here in Ames. I wanted to start, I think, by saying, I think it was Steve said, and it's in the document, that, the police and the city hall employees, they're serving their customers. And I think that it's important that we take that and examine it, because the people of Ames aren't just your customers, they're also your constituents and brothers and sisters and fathers and whatever. So first of all, maybe just examine that language a little bit. I would like to point out a few things. The first is the regulation for dealing with unlawful crowds. An unlawful crowd is not the same thing as a violent crowd. A protest that is deemed unlawful could be breaking a curfew, or could be, blocking traffic and inconveniencing people, or they could be lighting things on fire, or they could be trying to hurt people. I think that it's really important that if we're going to go forward with these regulations and try to improve them, we need to be distinct and explicit in our language. Property damage is not the same thing as violence. And a lot of these guidelines use language of should, and maybe should use language like shall. I think that Andrew addressed much of this earlier as well, like the duty to intercede. I also think that the ACPAC should have access, if we have the legality at the state level, should have access to body camera footage for use of force, not just complaints, so that they can evaluate and should report on whether they find use of force complaints and use of force incidents to be reasonable, and the statistics associated with the reasonableness of these uses of force as well. The last thing I would leave with a question, and it again goes back to something that Andrew was saying. I went through the ISU PD's civilian police academy years ago, and they at the time didn't carry firearms at all as a regular course of duty, only carried tasers, and had to get, sort of emergency dispensation to use them. So I'm wondering why if that could work for Ames, or why would it not? I guess that's all. My time is up. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
The next speaker is Serena Paulson.
Hi, my name is Serena Paulson, and my address is 3213 West Street. I just want to say, thank you to Nicole for bringing up students on ACPAC. I think it's really important that we have really diverse representation on that council. And thank you, Mayor Hyla, for talking about wanting to include students. I really appreciate that because they are such a large part of our city. One of my main concerns goes back to what Mark said about statistics and asking for race and letting people disclose it if they choose to. I think that's super important if we're going to be looking at these statistics, and when it comes to arrests in Ames, and how we can make sure that we are being equitable and treating people fairly when it comes to racial biases. I know that it might have some legality issues, but I think it's really important that if we can get that information, we should, rather than leaving such a large unknown category. One of my other really big important things is having full transparency when it comes to ACPAC. So again, having that entire process be transparent, and letting the whole community decide on that board. Right now it's stipulated that it's the mayor and then the council voting, but I would like larger sets of input on who is screening these candidates and what qualifications are deemed reasonable to be on ACPAC. I personally don't believe that being a member of Black Lives Matter organization in Ames should disqualify you. I think it actually makes you more qualified to serve on this committee because you are trying to seek justice in the Ames community. Those are my primary concerns. I'm really excited to see how this moves forward and how we can give ACPAC teeth in recommending updated policies and procedures with the police and overseeing reports that come out. So thank you.
Serena, before you go, could you clarify, you said something about full transparency. I think you're talking about ACPAC. Can you expound upon that just a little bit for us?
So when it comes to reports and making things public, anything that ACPAC receives, I think it should be made public for the entire community, keeping that transparency so we're not only keeping the police department accountable within ACPAC, but ACPAC is reporting to the entire community. That's my personal opinion, is that if ACPAC is dealing with this at a community level, that the entire community should get to see what they see, so that there's conversations being had across, because those people should be representative of what the community wants.
I see. Thank you.
That makes sense.
That's helpful.
Thank you.
The next speaker is John Wolseth.
Yes, thank you. John Wolseth, 902 Arizona Avenue, 50014. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak tonight. I've got 3 points that I'd like to make. The first is that the report sets out to, in which the city manager claims that there's not a culture of bias that exists. We don't have any actual data to say what that culture of bias might be. And I think this is even more troubling to the point is that there doesn't seem to be any transparent offering of data, nor the means to collect that data, especially being able to associate demographic data with number of incidents, with incidents per police officer, and making that information available to the public to evaluate. We would be able to see a culture of bias if we were able to look at the cross-reference the demographics with the incident with the officer. Second, I echo the calls for greater transparency and maybe greater teeth for ACPAC. I think that's necessary. And I think finally, one way that could be a test for the city's commitment to that transparency and community involvement would be in the search for the next chief of police for the city of Ames. I would highly encourage the council to recommend including representation on the hiring selection committee by community members, especially members from communities of color, the LGBTQ community, and members of the immigrant and refugee communities as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
The next speaker is Seba Fahim.
Hi, I got my mic to work.
There we go. Good.
Yes. Sorry about that. Okay, so Seba Fahim, I live at 1930 Long Road, Ames, Iowa. And I just wanted to say that I appreciate these recommendations coming out and us discussing them, but I don't believe that they go far enough. I think the big area that needs clarification is on funding. The majority of the expenditure of the police department is on patrol, about 82%. And so I'm still unclear about why we are spending this much on patrol. Does that lead to a visible decrease in violent crimes? And so for spending this $6 million on patrols, not even investigations, patrols, we need to make sure that we're getting gain out of it, because just spending that money there and not being able to get anything out of it is a waste of that money. That money could be spent on social services to help promote and support people, like better funding for access or mental health care or drug prevention. Any of those different things that money could go to would be better than just being spent on patrols that aren't reducing crime. So yeah, that's an area that I think needs to be elucidated.
Thank you.
The next speaker is Kara Pryor.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Okay, I'm Cara Pryor. I live at 1712 Wilson here in Ames. And I, want to thank the city and the council for doing this study and offering this session. And I also feel that it's, to me, it doesn't feel like exactly the right place to start. I think that we are, we definitely are in one of the largest civil rights movements, if not the largest in history right now in the US. And we're all kind of waking up to how big and how deep of a problem racism is. And so today we're talking about how that plays out through police departments. And I think that it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I appreciate all the work that has gone into this report and all the work that the individual police officers do, but it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me to start by justifying justifying what they're doing now or justifying their funding now without first doing a study on what systemic racism looks like in Ames and what it would look like
to be sure that racial bias wasn't a factor, as someone else just said, that we need, that's not something that we can just say because we don't see it. Racism is so endemic in our culture that we need to examine ourselves and our communities closely and probably do a lot of anti-racist work before we can say something like that. So I would just like to see more, I mean, the notes that I've been writing to myself are that I'm wondering if the city council would consider asking Black history experts or anti-racism experts at ISU or elsewhere to do a study or a session like this that's focused on that aspect and not starting with the police department, which may be kind of where changes need to end up being made, but is not necessarily the center of the problem. Was also wanted to mention, I know that Ames BLM has asked to speak with City Council because so many of these issues are they're so big, and there's so much that needs to be said from the Black community and other marginalized communities here that can't be said in 3 minutes. So whether it's from them or someone else, I would love to hear the City Council spend more time with people who can tell you about the Black experience, especially here. So.
Thank you, Kara.
The next speaker is Apple Amos.
Hi, I live at 3303 West Street. I would just like to again reiterate and hope that you folks are all taking into consideration a lot of the points that were being made, especially the point that was just made about how this issue is being handled. And I'd really like to focus on the fact that I think a lot of the discussions during the 2 hours that you were going over the document seem to come down to assuming that issues in policing have to do with issues with individuals and not issues with the criminal justice system itself and policing itself, which I find to be a miscommunication or a misunderstanding between what BLM nationally and what BLM in Ames is asking for and talking about. I think if this was an issue with an individual or with individuals, you would not be seeing people as upset or in the streets right now. And I would also like to call attention to, I think there's a lot of praise for the police department here because we haven't seen things like George Floyd happen in Ames. But specifically Ames BLM and other community members are interested in seeing that never happen here, as opposed to making sweeping changes in the event of such a thing. And that if those things can happen in Kenosha, Wyoming, or Kenosha, Wisconsin, which is a small college town that experienced a brutal murder of a Black person or brutal shooting of a Black person by their police department, which also had similar anti-racist efforts in place, then those things can happen in Ames.
Anything else?
That was my main point.
Okay, thank you, Apple.
I do not see anyone else's hand raised.
Okay, we will go ahead and close public comment then. And I just want to say on behalf of council, thank you for everyone endeavoring to respect the time limits and also being succinct and clear in their communications. Okay, council, any further discussion or questions? And I was trying to there's a number of questions that were posed. I'm not sure I'm going to get them all. But Jeff, could I ask just a couple of questions for you that I wrote down? Can you comment on the body camera footage? Andrew Meyer asked about the policy and how long it's kept and who can access that?
So if you're talking about retention periods for body-worn camera, it depends on the incident.
Okay.
Arrests, I believe, and this is kind of off the top of my head, but I think arrests are 3 years. There's some cases that we would keep generally forever. A homicide investigation would be kept pretty much forever. Other incidents, I think, start to fall off after 1 year. So a traffic stop that doesn't involve an arrest might fall off after a year. I think that's why we have 22 terabytes of data on the drives right now, is we retain a lot of information. And we haven't hit the retention period for some of those incidents yet. So right now, the database grows every day and nothing's dropping off yet because we haven't even hit 3 years. So, and I want to make sure I got the second part of the question.
I think the question was, who can access that information or that video?
So anybody can make a request for video, just like reports, and there's an evaluation that takes place. There's some information that's protected by state law about police officer reports. So there is an evaluation that has to take place when there is a request.
Okay. And then they also asked about the tear gas. Why have it at all? Maybe that's something that you could actually, I'm just going to defer that. That's probably something that could be referred to staff for further discussion, or if that's something that council wants to look at. And then the other question I had was, Deborah Fink asked about, we said there's no surplus military vehicles, but she asked, is there any other surplus military equipment that the city has?
Yes, we have a number of weapons that we did get out of a federal 1033 program. So rifles for our patrol cars, we got those through that program.
And just for those that are watching or participating, if I didn't ask your question, it's not because it's not important. I was just trying to catch the ones that can be easily addressed. And if council wants to follow up on some of these, we certainly can. I think I was trying to take as many notes as possible, and others maybe not doing the same thing. I think the minutes will probably reflect some of those questions also.
Other easy question I saw that someone had asked was about, do we have quotas for traffic stops?
Quotas are illegal, so there are no quotas.
Okay. Yeah, that was just one that looked like a fairly easy one to answer. So.
State law, very clear on that. Quotas are illegal.
Okay. Council, any other questions or comments as we draw this workshop item to a close tonight?
I do have one question. There are a couple of speakers who asked about the amount of funding that's going towards patrol. And it just occurred to me, I'm not sure actually everything that's covered under patrol. Can you give us a sense of all of the activities that would be included under that budget amount? I mean, not all the activities, but characterize them somehow.
Sure, that would be the patrol division. So the 3 patrol shifts, Safe Neighborhoods team comes out of that. There's another section that's investigations, which is also certified officers, but we just break it apart in between those divisions. We've also got support services and communications.
So generally a call for service would result in action by patrol?
Yeah, so when a call would come into the communications center, a patrol officer would be the one that goes out and takes that call for service and starts to get information. In some cases, those might be sent over to investigations for further follow-up, but almost everything starts with patrol.
All right, thanks.
Jeff, I think there was an observation made about unlawful crowds or unlawful assemblies, and the fact that there could be things like property damage that would make an assembly unlawful, which is not the same necessarily as violence, and how we define the need to use tear gas. Now, my own experience with tear gas is from being on that VISHA task force back in 2004, which I think might have been the last time APD actually used tear gas. But could you say something about the way you define an unlawful assembly that could require tear gas?
So an unlawful assembly, you're right, could be different than a violent riot or something. So there could be unlawful assemblies where we need to move people out of a certain location. It could be an unsafe location. It could be a private property. There are those types of circumstances. We'd be pretty resistant to use any kind of chemical munitions on a crowd that is not, committing acts of violence or property damage. But it still could happen if they were in a location that they absolutely had to be removed from. But again, I think that's going to be an outlier. The times that we've used chemical munitions in Ames has always been in a circumstance where there was violence, there was property damage. The city sustained hundreds of thousands of dollars in property damage at one of our riots. So again, we're resistant to the use of it. That's not what we want to do. We've actually had unlawful assemblies in Ames in the past 6 months that we've not used chemical munitions on. So it is illegal to block a city street and march down the street, but we have facilitated that, and we have not stopped that.
I had a question circling back around to the patrol question. How is there a metric you use or a guideline when you determine how many hours, employee hours to devote to patrol? Like in a place where you had more calls for service than you can handle, you would, I assume, put more hours into patrol. But is there a metric for like, oh, we have too much lax time where the patrol officers don't find their time occupied, and then do you reduce hours? Like, is that, how do hours get assigned in that way to patrol?
Okay, that might be a little difficult to answer. It's historical. So we track our calls for service. We can track to a certain extent our uncommitted time. But what I can tell you is we run a pretty lean police department. We don't have a lot of uncommitted time. Our officers are pretty busy, whether they're out patrolling or doing follow-up. And so we do make some determinations from day to day, time of day of week, other things that are going on, and how many officers we may need to accomplish the mission. We have some numbers we try not to go below, so we try and keep a certain number of officers available and on the street just based on our knowledge of Ames and how many calls for service we get. We know it takes at least that many officers to make sure that we can take the calls for service and do it safely. But I don't know that I can point to an exact metric that we use. It's probably more art than science.
Any other questions?
John, could you clarify, where do we go from here? Are you wanting additional council input on particular recommendations? How do we go forward?
What we do is council would move to, I would suggest, put the report in its entirety on a future agenda, and then you can go ahead and discuss, what may want to be talked about further. Would that be consistent, Steve, with your understanding too, versus picking and choosing tonight? It's more or less in toto, and then that way that would allow discussing, is there, there's 21 recommendations. Are all those going to be recommended to be followed? Would there be some that would be not implemented? Is there something else and I think the second thing would be that'd be the first thing, is moving to the report to an agenda. And then secondly, I guess if there's any follow-up questions that council might want to have, that staff could follow up on, with the information so when it's discussed in the future, anticipating, in the near future.
I think it'd be good for the city council to step back and absorb the information they received, not only from us, but the community. And there may be people who couldn't make it tonight that want to still have an opportunity to write you give you some input. So I think it should not wait months and months. I don't know if you want on the next council meeting or the end of October. But then you start thinking about some of the recommendations.
You mentioned
it would seem that like you said, not wait too long, but if you want to allow a few weeks for people to have a chance to contact council through emails and get into the flow of the agenda, maybe by the end of the month. But let staff make that decision in terms of items on the agenda for that particular meeting. Brown, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I think Stephen mentioned that, I mean, we want to have some conclusion on the recommendations we're going to pursue before we fill the chief position permanent. So it has, it sounded like that would be before the end of the year for sure. So at this point, maybe we just move that we want to see him come back and staff say when is that's what would be best.
Yeah, motion.
Understanding that it would be within, before, I mean, because we'd want to have that discussion, I would think, yeah, within the next
month or so.
Month or
yeah.
Max, to get it all ironed out in a position where you could have an idea how we're going to move forward. Is that all right? Are we ready for that motion?
Absolutely.
So I would move that we put this report and the recommendations from staff on a future agenda. Not to exceed 2 months.
Second.
All right. Moved by Katie Hansen, second by Bescher. Any discussion?
These are some good first steps. I think someone said that well, that I'm sure that there are people both who think, we're going way too far, and also people who think we are not going nearly far enough. But, I would say that I think these recommendations are a good starting point and a good place to, a good place to start and continue the conversation.
John, do you want any other comments tonight? I mean, I have a few other follow-up questions for council, but should we vote first?
Is it germane to the motion on the floor?
No, I mean, they're
Is it going to, would it influence the vote, do you think?
No.
Okay. How about you, Amber?
I mean, it's sort of generic in nature, so I can wait to make it. That's fine.
I was just curious if it's going to affect, do you think it would affect the outcome?
No.
Okay,
No.
right. And it calls for speculation, but I just want to make sure that we're not missing something. Okay.
No, they're just generic comments that I have.
Okay, all right. Everyone understand the motion? Those in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed or abstaining? Motion carried 6-0. Okay, thank you. Tim?
Yeah, so on the issue of the review committee, my challenges with this are pragmatic in nature, and maybe one thing that I would like to know, and maybe Brian, you could help us think through, for communities that have done something similar, how have they gone about their training? So, John, you have challenges filling the boards and commissions as it is. This is going to be a very special board, a special review committee that's going to require a particular level of training, and it's a very technical training in order for it to be meaningful. And I'm not committed that we're going to get this right the first time. It may take a while to fine tune this. That's fine. But that's going to be a challenge. And it's one of the challenges of having a student on there is because we're going to be cycling through students pretty quickly, and yet you're going to want to have some continuity on that. So that's going to be a challenge. But Brian, that would be on my short list if you could help us with thinking through some more particulars on the training.
I could just comment on the student piece. Tim, I think one way to potentially, with the training aspect, is to try and be out in front and try and see if we can get students that would be interested, let's say, a few months in advance. They can go ahead and do the training, and then essentially they would get on board when their term started. They'd already have the training done versus trying to get up to speed. So I think there's ways to get around it. I think all of us on council would agree that the important to have at a minimum one, maybe even two representatives. I'm not sure. That's a lot of conversation to go on yet, but having student representation, I just think there's a workaround on that. I'm comfortable with that, but you're right. It is a challenge to get people, and I think that the other thing is, before Brian jumps in, one of the things that's really important is that, and staff made it, included in the report, and that is that there is an objectivity that is neither in leaning one way or the other in terms of towards the police or against the police as well too, because we're trying to be a very objective review board to be beneficial to review policies, and so that's a lot of conversation to have yet on this, and it's just a starting point. So Brian.
Yes, I think one common theme among review boards that I have researched is that training is very extensive, and it needs to be. And it's not only the initial training, but an ongoing training regarding a variety of topics and from a variety of perspectives. And so I would imagine that it would involve not only assistance from the police department in explaining their policies, but also outside individuals such as the city attorney's office or the county attorney's office, perhaps, if we could make such a request, and others who would have expertise in the types of pertinent information for this board's work. But absolutely, I think training would be an ongoing commitment, and I think it should also be emphasized that this board would be, or this committee would need to be able to respond on pretty short notice. Timeliness is an important component of personnel investigations, and so we would need to ensure that not only would the board or the committee be able to go to regular meetings where they're gathering information or reviewing policies, but that they could also be called together on pretty short notice to review a case and provide their input. So we can continue to look at fleshing out what a training program in particular might look like, and have some more information for you the next time this comes up before the city council.
This is something that I think that will definitely be, that's one of the topics of discussion, when it comes back to, council and we start discussing. And I think this could even be one that would take quite a bit of time to talk about just as an agenda item by itself as we kind of work through it.
The other thing I want to just make as a comment tonight, I could not be more proud of our Ames Police Department. And I'm pretty confident I speak for City Council. And so I want to put my cards on the table. I want to appreciate the people who took the time to speak to us tonight. But I could not disagree more fervently with calls to dismantle our police. We have an outstanding police department, and good governance means that we tailor our solutions based on the challenges we face in our community, and not to apply a one-size-fits-all. I hope that I speak for all the council in this. I hope there are no council members that are seriously proposing any kind of reduction in our police department. And if they do, I think it'd be helpful to be transparent and put those cards on the table tonight so that the community can know where we stand on a major issue like that. This is only one piece of the broader subject of racial unity in our community. And there is much work to be done in education and other aspects of the community. There are people on this Zoom call tonight that are devoting a tremendous amount of time in those issues in the community, and we appreciate that. So policing is only one part of it, but I am very, very proud of our police department, and I don't want to let this meeting end tonight without acknowledging that.
I'm not comfortable putting any council member on the spot tonight, one way or the other. I think if someone wants to make a comment, that's up to them. But I don't think that someone being silent should communicate one way or the other from the standpoint of whether or not to fund or defund, and I'm not advocating one way or the other. It's make sure that, you know, to have that kind of call is pretty kind of out of the blue, and it's really not, I think, appropriate at this point in time to put people on the spot unless they want to do that.
It's a major issue, John. I mean, it's, this is a community conversation, and I think that the citizens are looking for direction as far as where we stand on these issues. And I think that the material that Steve and his crew put together is absolutely fantastic. And I think there will be broad support for the vast majority of these recommendations. But if council members don't wish to speak on that, it's fine. But I do think the community would be very interested to know if there are members on the council who genuinely believe we should defund our police.
Amber, do you have something you want to offer?
Yeah, I just had a couple of general comments, mostly because I've been thinking a lot about this meeting for the last couple of months and what the community reaction would be and what my own reaction would be to the report that was put together by the city manager and our chief. And I guess I should start by sharing that I have a little bit of a unique perspective into law enforcement. My dad is recently retired detective from the Des Moines Police Department, and my brother and brother-in-law are both current officers. And so I have that perspective, not just because of the way I was raised, but also for better or for worse, because my dad was very open and honest about the job and his cases and the challenges and the stresses that officers and their families face every day. I've had a lot of positive interactions with the Ames Police Department over my many years in Ames, whether that was as a victim of a crime, serving on a nonprofit board with an officer, doing ride-alongs, or even getting pulled over. And with that said, I also recognize that my experience is not the same experience that others in our community may have had. And it is important for us to listen and to understand those varying experiences. But what I saw in the report tonight is a lot of current practices and policies are what I believe are very representative of a police department that has a strong commitment to this community. And though I think everyone here, including the chief who said it tonight, knows that we aren't a perfect department, I echo what Tim said in that I think we can all be very proud of the men and women who serve and protect this community every day. There are certainly deep-seated problems in our criminal justice system, but it would be wrong to view every police department in that same manner. And I just think there was so much thoughtfulness that went into the recommendations. And while I don't agree with every detail, I think it was an important exercise in just working towards continual improvement, something that I think every organization and business aspires to do. And so I'll just close by thanking Steve and Jeff and the rest of the police department leadership for all of their work. And of course, Chief Sykosh as well, who recently retired. And again, just to echo Tim's point, a thank you to all of our officers. I think that their work is often thankless, but it does not go unnoticed by many of us in the community.
Anybody else wish to offer any input or comments?
Mayor, I'd like to just add a little bit to Amber's perspective. I appreciate what she had to say. And I think that one of the things that has made me feel much more comfortable with some of the recommendations is the spirit in which our police officers have reacted to this report, which suggests that they are interested in continuous improvement and becoming better than they are now. And that's not to say that they're bad at this point or severely lacking in anything. But if you want to be excellent, you continually strive for excellence. And so I am very heartened by the fact that our officers see these recommendations, especially the Citizen Advisory Commission, as an opportunity to become even better at the job that they love. And I hope they continue to love this job, because I think they're doing a great service for our community. With regard to defunding the police, I participated as an NAACP delegate to the National Convention over the past 2 weeks. And one of the things that I heard that stuck with me was an observation that was made by a panelist on the justice discussion. This panelist happened to be from Philadelphia, and he was asked about the phrase defund the police and whether it generated too much negativity, that people couldn't get behind it, and whether there wasn't another way to frame that. And his response was, if you don't want to say defund the police, then let's look at this from the other perspective, which is fund our communities of color and make sure that there is funding for social services and for affordable housing and for those other needs that may be contributing to the societal ills that police are all too often having to address. And so I really like the idea of focusing on that positive, that, you know, funding our communities of color or funding our communities who are underfunded in whatever way is perhaps a better way to look at the situation. And it may not involve defunding the police if we are continually looking at how our police officers are being used and whether they are serving the community in the best way possible. And it sounds like our department is already assessing whether officers need to be involved in all of the sorts of calls that they've traditionally been involved in. And I think that that process is a good one. And I hope that we are going to continue with that assessment, because I honestly believe that any process can be made better and any department can be made better. So I'm hoping that this is all going to be a very positive conversation that continues. And I just want to bring back into that conversation the possibility that we will be getting involved with our race, equity, and leadership team from the National League of Cities to start some additional planning for other ways in which we can examine what's happening systemically and throughout the community, as at least one of our speakers asked for.
Okay, don't see anybody else giving that kind of indication that wanting to share anything. I will just echo, or just I think it was yeah, Ms. Pryor made a comment about, you know, taking a broader look. And I go back to the Taking the Lead 2020, the NAACP 4 sessions that were held, and my opening comments every time were, it starts with each one of us in the entire community. It's not just one particular group or organization. And so, to Gloria's point, when she talks about race, equity, and leadership, and National League of Cities has some programs that we're going to be looking at in terms of looking at the community as a whole and helping us as council in terms of policy, how, you know, for training. But I think that we need to get some more information on that. But it's all of us, our entire community. It's not just one particular segment that we need to really work on to really help strengthen and address issues for all of us to be making this even a more welcoming place to live and call home. So, okay. We're going to move on to disposition of communications to council. There is one letter we received from the Chamber of Commerce requesting that council consider moving forward with rezoning the Prairie View property. Is there a
Let's have a request for a memo on that. Back to you.
I'd move that we staff for a memo.
Second.
moved by Corey, second by Garten? Those in favor of the motion say aye.
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 Any opposed or abstaining? Okay, council comments. We'll start with Rachel tonight.
I don't have any comments other than just thanking staff for putting together this really thorough report and looking forward to kind of bringing this back and having more specific discussions on some of these individual recommendations within the report.
Thank you. David?
I'll agree. This is a very interesting meeting, and our next conversations about it will be very interesting too. Thanks to staff for a great job in expressing what you were trying to say in the report.
Gloria?
I would like to thank our staff for another effort, and that was putting together a census parade last Friday, which combined coverage of the census with Get Out the Vote efforts by the League of Women Voters and the NAACP. We had 20 city vehicles involved in that census parade that went through town. I think Rachel was there, although I didn't see her. And we, I guess, within 24 hours, put this thing together. Susan Guiazda was at the helm of it. And the United States Census Bureau said that they were very impressed that this was the best effort that they had seen in this way. And I have since had feedback that we are now actually seeing some of our census enumerators being allowed into apartment complexes in West Ames that they were not previously allowed into. So I'm thinking that maybe this census caravan made an impact. So please, if you have not yet filled out your census, claim Ames if you live in Ames, and help us to get our fair share of federal funds and representation in Congress. That's it.
Thank you. Amber?
Nothing for me.
Tim?
Nothing further. Thanks.
Rowan?
Nothing for me.
And Nicole?
Yeah, so I just want to put the point out there that when we're advocating to improve our police department in Ames, we want to advocate for all minority groups, any identity, not just racial identity. So all the different genders, all the different sexualities, any type of identity needs to be treated equally. And I think that we really need to push for that as a big part of our improvement for the police department.
Thank you, Nicole. I would just echo the I can't imagine how much time and effort went into this report. Steve and Jeff and staff and Brian and I too thank you for those efforts. And it was a lot of things to compile, a lot of things to put together. And I think that there is some, a lot of things for council to really work with on this. So Jeff's screen is blank. I'm going to presume you can hear. There he is. All right. Thank you for your efforts, and thank you to the department also for participating in that. And it's just, and I think someone mentioned already, it's very encouraging to hear that. I think Gloria mentioned it, that there's an embracing of this and wanting to be in an improvement process. So anyway. All right, and thank you to all those that participated again, and those who may be watching. It's been a 3.5 hour long meeting, but an important one. And again, if you are interested in offering any input or comments, you're welcome to email the council so that we can get additional input as we move forward. So with that, I entertain a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
All right. We are adjourned, and have a good rest of the evening, and enjoy your week off next week. we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Good night, everyone.